You're cold. Two words from a 7-year-old boy that would shatter a billionaire's world and rewrite a fortune worth hundreds of millions. In a storm-lashed mansion where paranoia had replaced trust and cruelty masqueraded as wisdom, Gideon Vale set a trap that had worked a dozen times before. Cash left carelessly beside his chair, a test designed to prove that everyone steals when they think no one's watching. But today, the test would backfire in ways he never imagined, because the child who approached his chair carried something no amount of money could buy: a heart that chose kindness over survival. What happened next would haunt Gideon Vale for the rest of his life, transform a terrified mother and son, and ultimately determine who would inherit an empire. I invite you to follow this story to the very end, and please like and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The November rain hammered against the windows of Vale Manor like thousands of angry fists demanding entry. Inside the sprawling Gothic mansion that crowned the Massachusetts cliffs, Gideon Vale sat in his leather wingback chair, utterly still, eyes closed, breathing measured and deep. To anyone watching, the 75-year-old billionaire appeared to be napping in his favorite spot, the library where mahogany shelves stretched 20 feet toward coffered ceilings, and the smell of old leather and older money hung thick in the air. But Gideon wasn't sleeping. He was hunting. On the mahogany side table next to his chair, positioned with theatrical carelessness, sat an ivory envelope. $5,000 in crisp $100 bills spilled from its open mouth, fanned across the polished wood like a dealer's spread at a high-stakes poker game. A few bills had been deliberately nudged to the table's edge, as if they might flutter to the floor at any moment. Beside the money lay Gideon's leather-bound notebook, placed at an angle that suggested it had been carelessly dropped. Everything was bait. Gideon had perfected this performance over the past 3 years, ever since his wife Helen's death had transformed him from merely suspicious into something darker. A man convinced that the entire world was a theater of thieves, and that given the right opportunity, even the kindest mask would slip to reveal the grasping hands beneath. He'd tested 12 household employees this way. 12 times he'd watched through barely cracked eyelids as they'd glanced at the money, hesitated, rationalized, and taken it. Sometimes they'd stuffed bills in their pockets with trembling hands. Sometimes they'd been brazen, counting the cash before making it disappear. Once the housekeeper had actually paused to say a prayer before stealing, asking God to forgive her necessity, as if poverty sanctioned theft. Gideon had fired them all on the spot, his voice cold and righteous as he detailed their betrayal. Each termination had reinforced his certainty. Everyone had a price, everyone broke, eventually, and trust was the currency of fools. Today would be no different. Outside, the storm intensified, wind shrieking around the mansion's stone corners. Through his barely open eyes, Gideon could see the library door, solid oak currently ajar about 6 inches. Beyond it, he heard the hesitant footsteps of his newest maid, Maria Chen, a woman who'd been hired just 2 weeks ago by his estate manager. Maria was 34, recently widowed, and according to the background check Gideon's security team had conducted, drowning in medical debt from her late husband's cancer treatment, the perfect candidate for his test. Desperate people, Gideon believed, were the most predictable. Their morality had an exact dollar amount, and $5,000 was usually more than enough to find it. What Gideon didn't know, what his meticulous planning hadn't accounted for, was that Maria Chen had arrived at the mansion today carrying an additional variable that would unravel everything. The library door creaked wider. "Mr. Vale?" Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, tremulous with an anxiety that Gideon mentally cataloged as guilt in advance. "Mr. Vale, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but—" She stopped mid-sentence. Through the narrow slits of his eyelids, Gideon saw her freeze in the doorway, her cleaning supplies clutched against her chest like a shield. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, partially hidden by her frame, was a child. Gideon's carefully controlled breathing nearly hitched with surprise, but he maintained his performance. This wasn't part of the plan. The employment contract explicitly forbade employees from bringing family members to the estate. Maria knew this. It had been emphasized during her orientation. "Mama, I'll be quiet," the boy whispered, his voice so soft it barely carried across the library's expanse. "I promise." "Shh, Micah. Remember what I said. You have to be invisible." Maria's voice cracked with desperation. "If Mr. Vale sees you, we'll both be out on the street tonight, and we have nowhere else to go. Do you understand? Nowhere." Through his false sleep, Gideon studied the child. Micah appeared to be about 7, small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes too old for his face. He wore a thin jacket over a shirt that had been washed so many times the original color was anyone's guess, and sneakers with soles that were separating from the uppers. In his hands, he clutched a small backpack decorated with cartoon characters that had been popular several years ago. "I understand, Mama." Micah's voice carried a weight that made Gideon's chest tighten unexpectedly. This wasn't the voice of a child being denied a treat. This was the voice of a child who understood consequences, who'd already learned that survival required silence and invisibility. Maria glanced around the library frantically, her eyes skipping over Gideon in his chair. He could almost hear her thinking, "Still asleep, thank God, still asleep," before landing on a corner near the fireplace, partially hidden by a tall bookshelf. "There," she whispered, pointing. "Sit in that corner. Don't make a sound. Don't touch anything. Just do your homework until I come back, okay? I have to clean the West Wing, and that'll take at least 2 hours. Can you be invisible for 2 hours?" "Yes, Mama. I can be invisible." Micah moved toward the corner with practiced silence, each footstep carefully placed, his breathing controlled. This child had learned how to disappear, Gideon realized. How many times had he needed to become invisible? How many places had they been evicted from? How many situations had required this 7-year-old to master the art of taking up no space at all? Maria watched her son settle into the corner, then glanced back at Gideon one more time. He felt her gaze sweep over him, checking, hoping, praying he was truly asleep. Then she backed out of the library, pulling the door nearly closed behind her, leaving just enough gap for her to hear if disaster struck. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. Silence descended on the library, broken only by the storm's fury outside and the subtle sounds of a child trying not to exist. Gideon remained motionless in his chair, his performance unchanged, but his mind recalculating rapidly. This was unexpected, but not unmanageable. In fact, it was better. Now he would test 2 people instead of 1. Would the mother protect the child from temptation, or would she use him? Would the child be innocent or already corrupted? Would poverty and desperation override whatever values Maria Chen claimed to hold? The cynic in Gideon, the part that had grown like cancer since Helen's death, predicted the outcome with certainty. Maria would return within minutes, unable to focus on her work while $5,000 sat unguarded. She'd take it. Maybe she'd tell herself it was for her son, that desperation justified the theft, that a man with hundreds of millions wouldn't miss a few thousand. They always had excellent reasons. Minutes ticked by, marked by the brass clock on the mantel. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Maria didn't return. Through his barely open eyes, Gideon could see Micah in the corner, backpack open, a worn notebook and pencil in his small hands. The boy was actually doing homework, his head bent over the page with intense concentration. Every few minutes he'd pause, chewing the pencil eraser, thinking, then write something down. Not once did he look toward the money on the table. Not once did his eyes wander to the expensive first editions on the shelves or the silver letter opener beside the envelope of cash. 20 minutes passed. 30. Gideon began to feel the physical strain of his performance, his back aching from the motionless position, his neck growing stiff. But he'd maintained this charade for over an hour before when testing other employees. He could outlast a 7-year-old's attention span. Eventually, curiosity would win. Eventually, the child would notice the money, and the test would proceed. But something was wrong. Not with the test. With him. As Gideon watched Micah work diligently on his homework in that corner, trying so hard to be invisible, trying so desperately to justify his existence in a space that clearly terrified him, something uncomfortable began stirring in Gideon's chest. Something that felt dangerously like shame. The boy's jacket was inadequate for November in Massachusetts. Even inside the heated mansion, Gideon could see Micah shiver occasionally, pulling the thin fabric tighter around his small frame. The child's focus on his homework was absolute, as if good grades might somehow be the ticket to a better life, as if perfect behavior might prevent the next eviction. 40 minutes. 50. Micah finished his homework and carefully returned the notebook to his backpack. Then he simply sat there, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing, being invisible, being good, being so small and quiet that maybe the world would let him and his mother stay in whatever temporary space they'd found. And still, not once did he look at the money. Gideon found himself almost willing the child to notice it, to give him the confirmation he needed that everyone was the same, that Helen had been wrong when she'd insisted until her dying breath that goodness existed, that some people chose integrity even when no one was watching. "You're too cynical, Gideon," Helen had whispered in her final days, her hand weak in his. "You're going to die alone in that big house, surrounded by locks and suspicions, and you'll never know how much beauty you missed while you were busy protecting yourself from imaginary threats." "They're not imaginary," Gideon had insisted. "People are opportunists. They take what they can get." "Some do," Helen had agreed, her eyes still full of a kindness that Gideon couldn't understand. "But some don't. Some people are good even when goodness costs them everything. Those are the ones worth knowing. Those are the ones who make life worth living." Then she'd closed her eyes and left him alone with his certainty and his tests and his mansion full of expensive things and empty rooms. An hour passed. Micah remained motionless in his corner, occasionally shivering, never complaining. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, rain now mixed with sleet that clattered against the windows like rice thrown at a wedding nobody wanted to attend. Then Gideon noticed something that made his carefully controlled breathing almost stop. Micah was looking at him, not at the money, at him. The boy's gaze was fixed on Gideon's face, and there was something in his expression that Gideon couldn't immediately identify. Not greed, not calculation. It took several seconds before Gideon recognized it. Concern. Micah was worried about him. The boy's eyes moved from Gideon's face to his hands, which Gideon had deliberately left uncovered, resting on the chair's arms. Then Micah looked down at his own hands, still clutching his thin jacket closed. The child sat there for a long moment, clearly thinking, clearly debating something. Then, moving with agonizing slowness, the kind of careful movement that suggested he was approaching something dangerous, Micah stood up. "Here it comes," Gideon thought, his heart rate accelerating despite his conscious control. "Now he'll take the money. Now I'll see what desperation looks like at 7 years old." But Micah didn't move toward the table. He moved toward Gideon. The boy approached with the caution of someone approaching a sleeping lion, each step deliberate and silent. When he reached the chair, he stood there for a moment, studying Gideon's face with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Then, in a movement so gentle it barely registered as physical contact, Micah removed his own jacket and carefully draped it over Gideon's legs. "You're cold," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury outside. The jacket was pathetically inadequate. Thin fabric, worn at the elbows, providing no meaningful warmth. But the gesture hit Gideon like a physical blow, knocking something loose in his chest that had been locked tight since Helen's funeral. Micah stood there for another moment, making sure the jacket was arranged properly over Gideon's legs, then turned his attention to the table. Gideon felt his cynicism rear up, ready to be confirmed. Here it is. Here's the real motive. The kindness was just a setup. But the boy didn't touch the money. Instead, with the same careful gentleness, Micah noticed that several bills had worked their way to the very edge of the table, precarious and likely to fall. The child carefully nudged them back toward the center, gathering them into a neater pile. Not taking them, not even holding them longer than necessary, just protecting them from falling. Then he noticed Gideon's leather notebook, positioned at the angle Gideon had deliberately staged to look carelessly dropped. Micah picked it up with both hands, treating it with the kind of reverence he might show a holy text, and placed it carefully beside the money where it couldn't fall. The boy stepped back, surveying his work. The old man covered, the money protected, the valuable notebook safe, and nodded slightly, satisfied that he'd solved whatever problem he'd perceived. Then Micah returned to his corner, sat down, and wrapped his arms around himself, shivering harder now that he'd given away the only warmth he had. Gideon sat in his chair, his performance continuing automatically while his mind reeled trying to process what had just happened. The child had seen $5,000, more money than his mother probably earned in 3 months, and his instinct hadn't been to take it. His instinct had been to protect it, to protect the notebook, to protect the old man he believed was sleeping, cold, and vulnerable. And the cost of that protection was Micah's own comfort. The boy was visibly shivering now, hugging himself in that corner, but he didn't retrieve his jacket. He'd made a choice, had decided that an old man's warmth mattered more than his own, and he was living with the consequences without complaint. For the first time in 3 years since the morning Helen had died and Gideon had decided the world was fundamentally rotten, a crack appeared in his certainty. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Micah shivered in his corner, occasionally rubbing his arms to generate warmth, but never once looking at his jacket draped over the supposedly sleeping billionaire's legs. Never once approaching the table where $5,000 sat unguarded. The boy had made his choice and seemed content with it, even though contentment apparently involved mild hypothermia. Gideon wanted to end the charade, to sit up and acknowledge what had happened, but something kept him frozen in his performance. Partly it was years of practiced cynicism insisting there had to be more to this, some angle he wasn't seeing, but mostly it was something else entirely, a desperate, shameful need to stay invisible himself, to remain the observer rather than become the observed, because the moment he acknowledged what Micah had done, he would have to acknowledge what he himself had become. 75 minutes after Maria had left, approaching the time she'd said she'd return, Gideon heard rapid footsteps in the hallway. Maria burst through the library door, her face tight with anxiety, her eyes immediately seeking her son. "Micah, are you—" She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze landing on the scene before her, her son in the corner, arms wrapped around himself, shivering. The supposedly sleeping billionaire, and her son's jacket draped over Gideon's legs. Her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, then absolute terror. "Oh God," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of prayers and curses combined. "Oh God, Micah, what did you do?" She rushed to Gideon's chair, careful not to wake him, but moving with frantic urgency, and snatched the jacket from his legs. Then her eyes fell on the money, still there, still in its neat pile where Micah had carefully arranged it, and her terror somehow intensified. "Did you touch this?" she hissed at her son, holding the jacket like evidence in a trial that had already delivered its verdict. "Did you touch Mr. Vale's money?" "I just moved it so it wouldn't fall, Mama." Micah's voice was small but clear, carrying no guilt because he understood he'd done nothing wrong. At 7 years old, he couldn't comprehend how an act of kindness could be mistaken for a crime. "And I covered him because he looked cold. I was trying to help." "Help?" Maria's laugh was hollow, broken. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't understand. We're not supposed to—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting tears. She glanced at the money again, then at Gideon, and Gideon could see the calculations racing behind her eyes. She'd left her son alone with $5,000 in cash and a sleeping billionaire, and had returned to find her son's jacket on that billionaire and the money rearranged. To anyone watching, it looked like the first stage of theft interrupted. It looked like a child caught in the act. It looked, Gideon realized with sick clarity, exactly like the trap he'd set, except the trap had caught the wrong prey. "We need to leave," Maria said, her voice shaking as she pulled Micah to his feet. "Right now, before he wakes up. If he thinks you tried to steal—" "But I didn't, Mama. I know, baby, I know." She wrapped the jacket around her son's shoulders, then grabbed his backpack with her free hand. "But Mr. Vale won't know that. He'll think—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the nightmare scenario she was imagining, but Gideon understood it perfectly because he'd designed it. She was imagining exactly what Gideon had intended: an accusation of theft, immediate termination, possible criminal charges, and the end of whatever fragile stability she'd managed to build for her son. Maria ushered Micah toward the door, moving quickly but quietly, still trying not to wake the man she believed was sleeping. But as they reached the threshold, Gideon made a decision that surprised even himself. He woke up. "Leaving so soon?" His voice cut through the library like a blade, sharp and cold and calculated. The same voice he'd used 12 times before when confronting employees he'd caught stealing. The voice that had always delivered the verdict he'd already determined before the test began. Maria froze, her hand still gripping Micah's shoulder. Slowly she turned to face him, her expression a complex mixture of terror, defiance, and resignation. "Mr. Vale," she managed, her voice barely steady. "I can explain, can you?" Gideon sat forward in his chair, and the movement was precise, practiced, theatrical. He gestured toward the money on the table, then at the jacket Micah now wore. Because from where I'm sitting, the explanation seems fairly clear. He didn't steal anything. The words burst from Maria with desperate force. I swear to you, Mr. Vale, my son didn't take a single dollar. He was trying to help. He thought you were cold. He was trying to be kind. Kind. Gideon repeated the word as if tasting something sour. Is that what we're calling it now? He stood, and despite his 75 years, he was still an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from decades of commanding boardrooms and bending institutions to his will. He'd built his fortune through ruthlessness, masked as wisdom, and he knew exactly how to wield both. Mr. Vale, please. Maria stepped in front of her son, physical shield raised. If you're going to fire me, fine, I understand, but don't. Her voice broke. Don't call the police. Don't accuse him of something he didn't do. He's 7 years old. He doesn't understand. Doesn't understand what? Gideon moved toward the table, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. Doesn't understand property, boundaries, the difference between what belongs to him and what belongs to others? He understands perfectly. Maria's voice rose, fear transforming into something fiercer. He understands that when someone looks cold, you try to help them, even if it costs you. He understands that when something valuable might fall, you protect it. He understands kindness, Mr. Vale, which apparently is more than I can say for some people who own mansions. The words hung in the air between them, and Gideon felt something shift in his chest. Not anger. He'd expected defiance, had factored it into the script he'd written for this confrontation. What he felt instead was something closer to shame, sharp and unexpected, like stepping on broken glass in the dark. But he'd come too far to stop now. The performance demanded completion. Let me tell you what I understand, Gideon said, his voice dropping to the cold, measured tone that had made corporate executives sweat during negotiations. I understand that you violated your employment contract by bringing your son here. I understand that you left him unsupervised in my private library. And I understand that during that time, my property was disturbed and rearranged by unauthorized hands. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in dark water, then gestured toward his leather wingback chair. I also understand that there's a damp spot on this chair's velvet upholstery, custom fabric imported from Italy, part of a set that belonged to my late wife. And it's damaged now. Maria's eyes went wide with new horror. Damaged? But he just put his jacket, his wet jacket. Gideon pointed to the spot in question, barely visible but definitely there, a slight darkening where moisture had transferred from Micah's rain-dampened coat to the expensive velvet. From playing in the rain, I assume? Or was the jacket already wet when you brought him here? We walked from the bus stop. Maria's voice had gone hollow. 3 blocks in the rain because we can't afford... She stopped herself, but the damage was done. She'd revealed exactly what Gideon had expected, poverty as both motivation and excuse. The restoration alone will cost $500, Gideon continued, the number pulled from air but delivered with absolute certainty. Professional cleaning, probably reupholstering if the stain sets. $500 because your son couldn't keep his hands and his wet jacket off of things that don't belong to him. It was a lie, of course. The damage was minimal, would dry on its own, might not even be visible by morning. But Gideon needed to apply pressure, needed to see how they would respond when the stakes escalated beyond termination into actual financial consequence. I don't have $500, Maria said, and the words came out broken, each one a small death. I don't have $50, Mr. Vale. I have $12 in my account, and a stack of medical bills I'll never finish paying, and a son who needs shoes and a coat that actually keeps him warm. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice stayed steady, determined. So if you want to sue me, fine. Get in line behind the hospital and the funeral home and the credit card companies. But don't you dare... Her voice finally cracked. Don't you dare blame my son for trying to show kindness to someone who clearly hasn't experienced it in a very long time. The words hit harder than Gideon had anticipated, cutting through layers of cynicism and performance to strike something raw and undefended. He opened his mouth to deliver the next line in his script, the ultimatum, the choice between payment and police. But before he could speak, something happened that stopped him cold. Micah stepped out from behind his mother and walked toward the table. "Micah, no!" Maria reached for him, but the boy was already moving with the same careful deliberation he'd shown earlier, approaching danger with open eyes and steady hands. He reached into his backpack and pulled something out. For a surreal moment, Gideon thought the child actually had money hidden away, that the cynical script was going to play out after all. But what Micah placed on the mahogany table, next to the $5,000 in cash, was a small toy car. It was battered, the red paint worn away to gray metal in places. One wheel was missing entirely, leaving it unable to roll properly. The remaining wheels were scratched and dented. The tiny plastic windshield was cracked. Everything about it screamed of age and use and poverty. But the way Micah placed it on the table, gently, reverently, as if presenting something sacred, suggested it was the most valuable thing in the world. "This was my daddy's," Micah said, his voice clear and steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "He gave it to me before he got sick. It's the only thing I have from him." The boy looked up at Gideon, and the old billionaire found himself unable to look away from those eyes. Too old, too wise, carrying knowledge no 7-year-old should possess. "I know it's not worth $500. I know it's just a broken toy. But it's all I have to give you, so maybe you could take it instead of making Mama pay money she doesn't have." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the storm outside and the sound of Maria's muffled sobs as she pressed her hand over her mouth. Gideon stared at the toy car, this broken piece of plastic and metal that represented a dead father and a childhood lived in the margins, and something inside him shattered so completely he heard it break. This was the moment. This was the choice Helen had talked about in her final days. The choice between the world he'd constructed in his paranoia and the world that actually existed. Between the test he'd designed to confirm his cynicism and the truth that had been offered freely by a child who had every reason to be cynical himself. Micah hadn't stolen the $5,000 because he understood something Gideon had forgotten. Not everything has a price, and some things, like kindness, like protecting someone you believe is vulnerable, like giving away your warmth even when you're cold, those things exist outside of transactions entirely. And now this child was offering to surrender the last physical connection to his father because he'd been taught that debts must be paid, that nothing comes free, that even acts of kindness can be twisted into obligations you can't afford. Gideon had designed this test to prove that everyone breaks eventually, that poverty destroys integrity, that trust is the currency of fools. Instead, a 7-year-old boy had just taught him that the only fool in the room was the one who'd confused surveillance for wisdom and cruelty for protection. Gideon reached for the toy car with a hand that trembled slightly, the first crack in his performance, the first genuine emotion he'd allowed himself to show in 3 years. He picked up the battered vehicle, felt its weight in his palm, traced the missing wheel with his thumb. "Micah," he said, and his voice came out different than he'd intended, softer, uncertain, missing the edge of cruelty that had defined him since Helen's death. "How did your father's car lose its wheel?" The question seemed to surprise both Maria and Micah. The boy wiped his eyes and said, "I dropped it down the stairs at our old apartment before Daddy died. He said it was okay, that it still had 3 wheels, and that was enough to keep going. He said sometimes you lose pieces, but you keep moving anyway." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was the best man," Micah said simply, and the past tense carried a weight that made Gideon's chest ache. Gideon set the car down carefully, then moved to the table where the $5,000 still sat in its neat pile. He picked up the envelope, and both Maria and Micah tensed visibly, waiting for whatever judgment was about to fall. But instead of accusations or ultimatums, Gideon did something he hadn't planned, something that diverged entirely from the script he'd written for this confrontation. He held the envelope out to Maria. "Take it," he said. Maria stared at the money as if it might bite her. "What?" "The $5,000, take it." When she didn't move, Gideon added, "Consider it a bonus for the lesson your son just taught me." "I don't understand." Maria's voice shook. "What lesson? What are you—" "The lesson that I'm the one who's broken." Gideon lowered the envelope, suddenly unable to maintain eye contact. Not the chair, not your son. Me. He crossed to his desk, pulled out his checkbook, an affectation from an earlier era, but one he maintained because digital transactions felt too impersonal for certain kinds of business, and began writing. The scratch of pen on paper filled the silence as Maria and Micah watched, confused and afraid. When he finished, Gideon tore out the check and held it alongside the envelope of cash. "The $5,000 is for immediate expenses," he said. "Medical bills, a new coat for Micah, shoes that don't have holes, food that's more than rice, and canned soup. The check is for $20,000. That's for the medical debt you mentioned and whatever else you need to establish some stability." Maria's face had gone pale. "Mr. Vale, I can't." "You can and you will." Gideon's voice carried some of its old authority, but the cruelty had drained away, leaving only determination. "Consider it payment for a service rendered." "What service?" Maria looked like she might faint. "I clean your house." "That's not worth Your son taught me something today that I'd forgotten." Gideon looked at Micah, who was watching the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. "He taught me that not everyone takes what they can get, that some people give what they can't afford to lose, that kindness still exists, even in places where I'd convinced myself it had died." He paused, then added quietly, "My wife tried to tell me that before she passed. She said I was going to die alone, surrounded by locks and suspicions, never knowing how much beauty I'd missed while I was busy protecting myself from imaginary threats. I thought she was wrong. I thought I was being realistic, practical, wise. But I wasn't being wise. I was being a coward. And it took a 7-year-old boy with a wet jacket to show me the truth." Maria took the envelope and check with trembling hands, looking at them as if they might disappear. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just—" Gideon stopped, surprised by the emotion catching in his throat. "Just let me make one more offer, an ongoing one." "What kind of offer?" Gideon looked at Micah again, at this child who'd offered his father's car as payment for a debt that didn't exist, who'd surrendered his own warmth to cover a stranger, who'd protected money he could have taken without consequence. "Micah can come here after school," Gideon said, "do his homework in the library, help me with small tasks, organizing books, that kind of thing. Nothing taxing. And in exchange, I'll fund his education, all the way through college, books, tuition, whatever he needs." "Why?" The question came from Micah himself, his young voice cutting through the complexity to find the essential question. "Why would you do that for me?" Gideon knelt down, his knees protesting but managing the descent, until he was eye level with the boy. "Because you gave me a jacket when you were cold," he said simply. "Because you protected money you could have taken. Because you offered to give up your father's car to protect your mother. And because I've spent 3 years testing people to prove they're rotten, and you failed my test so completely that you proved I was the one who needed fixing." He reached out and picked up the toy car again, turning it over in his hands. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "Not as payment, as a reminder of the day my life turned around." Micah looked at his mother, who nodded through her tears, then back at Gideon. "Okay," the boy said, "but you have to promise to take care of it. It was my daddy's." "I promise," Gideon said, and meant it with a depth of sincerity he hadn't felt in years. "I'll put it somewhere safe. Somewhere I can see it every day and remember what it cost you to offer it to me." He stood up, his knees complaining less than expected, and looked at Maria. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he said. "I know what I did today was cruel, setting a trap, watching you both, testing you like subjects in an experiment. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. Let me prove that I can learn. Let me prove that Micah's kindness wasn't wasted on someone who's too broken to change." Maria studied him for a long moment. This woman who'd survived a husband's death and drowning debt and the daily humiliations of poverty. And Gideon saw her weighing his words against his actions, his promises against his history. Finally, she said, "My son deserves better than what I can give him alone. If you're serious about helping him, really serious, not just feeling guilty for an afternoon, then yes, we'll accept your offer." "I'm serious," Gideon said, "more serious than I've been about anything in a very long time." The storm outside was beginning to ease, the sleet transitioning back to rain, then to drizzle. Through the library's tall windows, breaks in the clouds revealed patches of evening sky, the kind of uncertain clearing that suggests the worst is past, but makes no promises about tomorrow. Gideon placed the toy car on his desk, positioning it carefully beside the framed photo of Helen, the last picture taken before her diagnosis, when she still smiled easily and believed in people and thought her husband might someday remember how to do the same. Helen would have liked you, he said to Micah. Both of you. She always believed people were better than I gave them credit for. She was right. He looked at the child who'd given a cold man warmth, who'd protected what he could have stolen, who'd offered everything for nothing in return. Thank you, Gideon said quietly, for failing my test, for being exactly the kind of person I'd convinced myself didn't exist anymore. Micah smiled then, the first genuine smile Gideon had seen from him, and it transformed his face from something guarded and ancient into something that looked almost 7 years old. You're welcome, Mr. Vale, the boy said, and thank you for letting me keep my daddy's car safe here. I think Daddy would be happy knowing it helped somebody. Outside, the storm's fury continued to dissipate, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the promise of clearing skies. In the library of Vale Manor, a 75-year-old billionaire who'd spent 3 years proving the world was rotten looked at a battered toy car missing one wheel and felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from realizing you've been wrong about everything that matters, and discovering that being wrong might actually be the first step toward being right. The following Monday arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that follows storms, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and presented afresh for examination. Gideon stood at his library window, watching the hired car pull up the circular drive precisely at 3:30, exactly when he'd arranged for Maria and Micah to arrive. His hand rested on the toy car he'd placed on the windowsill, the battered red vehicle with 3 wheels that had become his talisman, his reminder that cynicism could be unlearned if you were willing to bear the cost of being wrong. He'd spent the weekend in a state of uncomfortable self-reflection, wandering through rooms that suddenly felt too large and too empty, examining the locks he'd installed on doors that had never needed them, counting the security cameras he'd positioned to catch employees in acts of theft that mostly existed in his imagination. Helen's voice had followed him through those empty halls, not haunting, but clarifying, repeating the words she'd said in those final days. You're going to die alone, surrounded by locks and suspicions. She'd been right. He'd been dying exactly that way, not physically, but in every way that mattered. Each test he'd conducted, each employee he'd caught and fired, each confirmation of his darkest suspicions had been another kind of death, a small murder of the man he'd been, before grief had twisted him into something unrecognizable. But Micah had offered him resurrection, and Gideon was determined not to waste it. The car door opened and Maria emerged first, dressed in the same worn clothing she'd worn on Friday but carrying herself differently, straighter, with less of the hunted wariness that had defined her movements before. She turned to help Micah out of the back seat, and Gideon felt his breath catch. The boy was wearing a new coat. Not expensive, not the kind of designer winter wear that Gideon's own grandchildren had worn during their brief obligatory visits, but new, a royal blue puffer jacket that actually fit, that was rated for New England winters, that would keep him warm when the real cold arrived. New shoes, too, proper sneakers with intact soles and laces that matched. And in Micah's hands, a new backpack, this one without cartoon characters, sturdy and practical. Maria had spent some of the money already. Good. That had been the point. Gideon opened the front door himself rather than waiting for his butler Edmund to answer it, a small break in protocol that made Edmund raise his eyebrows slightly from his position near the entrance to the west wing. The elderly butler had been with Gideon for 40 years and had witnessed the gradual descent into paranoia that had followed Helen's death. He'd said nothing about the tests, the cameras, the deliberate cruelty disguised as wisdom, but Gideon had seen the disappointment in Edmund's eyes grow with each firing, each accusation, each confirmation that his employer had become someone Helen wouldn't have recognized. Mr. Vale, Maria said as she reached the top of the stone steps, her voice cautious but warmer than it had been on Friday. Thank you for everything, for the opportunity, for your generosity. Thank you for accepting it, Gideon replied, then looked down at Micah. That's a fine coat. Mama says I have to take good care of it, Micah said seriously, running his hand along the sleeve. She says it costs more than 3 months of groceries used to, so I can't lose it or rip it. The casual mention of how they'd previously budgeted, measuring coats against foregone meals, made Gideon's chest tighten. How many times had this child gone cold so they could eat? How many necessities had been sacrificed to the mathematics of survival? If it rips, we'll get you another one, Gideon said. Coats are meant to be worn, not preserved like museum pieces. You're 7. You're supposed to play and fall and get dirty. That's what being 7 is for. Micah looked up at his mother questioningly, as if asking permission to believe this radical concept, and Maria nodded, though Gideon could see her mentally calculating the cost of replacement coats and filing that worry away for later consideration. Come in, Gideon said, stepping aside. We have work to do. He led them to the library, the scene of Friday's test and its unexpected conclusion. The room looked different in afternoon sunlight, warmer, less gothic, more like the sanctuary it had been when Helen was alive and they'd spent evenings here reading companionably, occasionally sharing passages aloud, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. Micah, you'll work here, Gideon said, gesturing to a large oak table he'd had Edmund move near the fireplace over the weekend. It's sturdy enough for homework, art projects, whatever you need. The drawers are empty. You can store supplies there. And these shelves, he indicated a section of bookcases he'd cleared of their contents, are yours. For your books, your things. Whatever you want to keep here. The boy approached the table as if approaching something sacred, running his hands along the polished wood surface. This is really mine. Really yours, Gideon confirmed. A workspace for someone serious about learning, which I'm told you are. He studies every night, Maria said quietly, pride and pain mixing in her voice. Even when we were staying in the shelter and he had to do homework under the hallway lights because they turned the room lights out at 9. Even then, he studied. Gideon absorbed this information, shelter, hallway lights, 9 o'clock curfews, and felt another crack form in the armor of ignorance he'd worn for 3 years. How easy it had been to judge from the heights of his mansion, to test people as if poverty were a moral failing rather than a circumstance, to confuse desperation with dishonesty. Well, there are no curfews here, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the emotion threatening to surface. And plenty of light. Now let me show you something. He walked to his desk and retrieved a wooden box he'd prepared over the weekend. Inside, nestled in velvet, was Micah's father's toy car, but transformed. Gideon had taken it to a restoration specialist in Boston, a man who usually worked on vintage automobiles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and asked him to fix a broken toy. The car gleamed now, its red paint restored to original brilliance, every scratch buffed away, every dent smoothed out. And the missing wheel had been replaced, but not with plastic. With gold. A tiny wheel, perfectly machined, genuine 18-karat gold that caught the light and turned a broken toy into something precious. I thought your father's car deserved to be whole again, Gideon said, holding the box out to Micah. If that's all right with you. Micah stared at the restored vehicle, his eyes wide, not touching it. Is that really my car? Really yours? The same one you offered me on Friday. I just had it repaired. But the wheel, it's gold. The boy looked up at Gideon with something approaching awe. Real gold? Real gold, Gideon confirmed. Your father told you that losing pieces doesn't mean you stop moving. He was right. But sometimes, when you find someone who cares, those pieces can be restored. Sometimes, broken things can be made whole again. He was talking about more than the car, and from Maria's sharp intake of breath, she understood. Micah reached into the box with trembling fingers and lifted the car out carefully. He turned it over, examining every restored surface, then set it on the table and gave it a gentle push. It rolled smoothly across the polished oak, the gold wheel glinting, no longer listing to one side or catching on its missing piece. It works, Micah whispered. It works perfect now. Keep it here, Gideon suggested. On your shelf, so you can see it while you study. A reminder that your father was right. You keep moving, even when you lose pieces. But also a reminder that broken things can heal if they're given time and care. The boy nodded solemnly, carrying the car to the empty shelves and placing it carefully on the center of the middle shelf, where it would be at eye level when he sat at his table. Then he turned back to Gideon and did something unexpected. He hugged him, not tentatively, not with the careful distance of a child who'd learned that adults were dangerous or unreliable, but with the full-body commitment of a 7-year-old who'd decided someone was safe. His arms wrapped around Gideon's waist, his face pressed against the old man's chest, and he held on with surprising strength. Gideon stood frozen for a moment, unused to physical affection since Helen's death, his grandchildren's hugs during their rare visits always feeling perfunctory and obligatory. But then muscle memory older than his grief kicked in, and his arms came up to return the embrace, his large hands gentle on the boy's small back. "Thank you," Micah said, his voice muffled against Gideon's sweater. "Thank you for fixing Daddy's car. Thank you for helping Mama. Thank you for letting me come here. Thank you for teaching an old fool that he'd been wrong about almost everything that matters," Gideon replied, his voice rougher than usual. When Micah finally released him and stepped back, Gideon looked up to find Maria crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son interact with someone who'd terrified her just 3 days ago. "I should get back to work," she said, wiping her eyes. "The East Wing won't clean itself." "Actually," Gideon said, making another decision he hadn't planned, "I'd like to discuss your employment situation. Could you join me in my study for a moment?" Alarm flashed across Maria's face. Employment situation sounded like professional language for termination, like the setup for bad news delivered behind closed doors. But she nodded and followed him down the hall to his private study, leaving Micah in the library with Edmund standing discreet guard in the doorway. Gideon's study was smaller than the library, more intimate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the cliffs and the ocean beyond. Helen's presence was stronger here, her favorite reading chair still positioned by the window, her coffee mug still on the side table where she'd left it the morning before she'd collapsed, the bookmark she'd been using still marking her place in a novel she'd never finish. "Mr. Vale, if this is about bringing Micah on Friday," Maria began, but Gideon raised his hand. "It's not. Or rather, it is, but not in the way you're thinking." He moved to his desk and pulled out a folder he'd prepared over the weekend. "I've been reviewing your employment contract and your situation, and I'd like to propose some changes." He opened the folder and extracted several documents. First, your salary. You're currently earning $15 an hour, 20 hours per week. That's poverty wages for someone doing the quality of work you do. I'm increasing it to $30 an hour, full-time if you want it. 40 hours a week with benefits, health insurance, dental, vision, paid vacation, sick leave. Maria's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Second, housing. You're currently living in a studio apartment in Dorchester with mold problems and a landlord who violates housing codes with impunity. I own several properties in better neighborhoods, including a 2-bedroom in Cambridge near good schools. You and Micah can live there rent-free as part of your employment package. Mr. Vale, I can't... Third, education. Micah's current school is overcrowded and underfunded. There's a private school in Cambridge, excellent academics, small class sizes, strong support for students who've experienced trauma or instability. I've already contacted the admissions office. They're prepared to offer Micah a full scholarship, which I'll be funding anonymously. Maria sat down heavily in Helen's reading chair, her face pale. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can," Gideon said simply. "Because I have resources I've been hoarding like a dragon protecting gold from imaginary thieves, and it turns out gold doesn't keep you warm at night. Because your son taught me something that my wife tried to tell me before she died, that some people deserve help, not because they've earned it through tests and trials, but simply because they're human beings trying to survive with dignity." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because I'm 75 years old, and I'd like to do something with the time I have left that isn't about catching people being their worst selves. I'd like to help someone be their best self instead." Maria was crying again, but differently now. Not the desperate tears of Friday when she'd thought her world was ending, but something deeper and more complex. Relief, yes, but also grief for all the years when help hadn't come, when she'd struggled alone, when her husband had died drowning in medical debt, and she'd been left to raise their son in shelters and moldy studios while working multiple jobs that barely covered food. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say yes," Gideon replied. "Say you'll accept the help. Say you'll let me prove that Micah's kindness wasn't wasted on someone too broken to change." She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "You're not broken, Mr. Vale. You're just someone who forgot how to trust people. But you're remembering. I can see it." "I'm trying to remember," Gideon corrected, "with help. Which is something else your son taught me, that sometimes you need to accept help, even when pride tells you to handle everything alone." Maria stood and extended her hand formally, and when Gideon shook it, her grip was strong and steady. "Yes," she said, "we accept. All of it. And thank you doesn't seem like enough, but thank you anyway. You're welcome. Now, there's paperwork to sign, keys to the Cambridge apartment to collect, and school registration to complete. Edmund will help coordinate everything. Take the rest of the day off, paid, obviously, and handle the logistics. Micah can stay here with me. We'll work on homework and I'll show him the library properly. How to find books, how the organization system works, that sort of thing." They returned to the library to find Micah already settled at his new table, homework spread out before him, working with the focused intensity Maria had described. Edmund stood nearby, having apparently appointed himself unofficial guardian, and the slight smile on the butler's face told Gideon that his longtime employee approved of these new developments. "Micah, I need to take care of some things with Mr. Vale," Maria said, kneeling beside her son's chair. "You'll stay here and work on your homework, okay? Mr. Vale is going to help you." "Okay, Mama." Micah looked up from his math worksheet. "Are you coming back?" "Of course I'm coming back," she kissed his forehead. "Always. I'll always come back." After Maria left with Edmund to handle the paperwork and apartment logistics, Gideon found himself alone in the library with a 7-year-old who'd somehow become the catalyst for upending his entire worldview. He approached the table where Micah was working and looked down at the math problems spread across the notebook. "Multiplication," he observed. "What are you working on?" "Times tables," Micah said. "We're supposed to memorize up to 12 times 12, but I keep getting the sevens mixed up." "Sevens are tricky," Gideon agreed. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside the boy. "May I show you a trick?" For the next hour, Gideon taught Micah multiplication techniques that he'd learned 65 years ago in a very different world when he'd been a scholarship student from a working-class family trying to prove he belonged at an elite prep school. The memories came flooding back, the pressure, the fear of failure, the determination to be better than the boys whose parents paid full tuition and owned summer homes and never had to think about whether they could afford new shoes. He'd succeeded, obviously, had built an empire from that determination, had proven himself in boardrooms and negotiation tables, had accumulated wealth that those prep school classmates could only envy. But somewhere along the way, success had curdled into suspicion, achievement into isolation, and he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply help someone learn something new without calculating what it cost him or what he'd gain in return. "I think I understand now," Micah said, working through a problem. 7 times 8 is 56 because 7 times 7 is 49, and then you add one more 7. "Exactly right," Gideon confirmed, feeling an unexpected swell of pride at the boy's understanding. "You're a quick learner." "Mama says education is how we get out of being poor," Micah said with the casual directness of children who haven't learned to hide difficult truths. "She says if I study hard and get good grades, maybe I can go to college and get a good job and not have to worry about money all the time like she does." "Your mother is wise," Gideon said carefully. "Education opens doors. But you know what else opens doors?" "What?" "Kindness, character, the ability to see someone in need and help them even when it costs you something." Gideon gestured toward the restored toy car on Micah's shelf. "You offered to give up your father's car to help your mother. That kind of character is rarer and more valuable than any degree." Micah considered this seriously. "But you can't get a job just by being nice to people." "Can't you?" Gideon smiled slightly. "What do you think happened on Friday? You were kind to me, covered me with your jacket, protected my money, offered your most precious possession. And now look where you are. New coat, new shoes, a scholarship to a better school, an apartment without mold. Your kindness literally changed your life. But that's because you're nice too," Micah pointed out with 7-year-old logic. Most people wouldn't do all this just because a kid put a jacket on them. You're right, Gideon admitted. Most people wouldn't, but that's partly my point. Kindness is valuable exactly because it's rare. And it's rare because it's hard. It costs something to be kind when you have nothing to spare. The fact that you were kind anyway tells me more about who you are than any test score ever could. They worked through the rest of the multiplication homework together, then moved on to reading comprehension. Micah was reading above grade level, tackling books meant for 4th or 5th graders, and Gideon found himself impressed by the boy's vocabulary and understanding. You read a lot, he observed. The library is free, Micah explained. And when we were in the shelter, the books were the only things that were really mine. Nobody could take them away or say I couldn't have them. I could go anywhere just by reading. The casual mention of the shelter, of a life where possessions were uncertain and privacy non-existent, made Gideon ache with recognition of how narrowly he'd been living, how much suffering existed just outside his gates while he'd been obsessing over cameras and tests, and the theoretical dishonesty of people he'd never bothered to actually know. You can borrow any book in this library, Gideon said, gesturing to the thousands of volumes surrounding them. Take them home. Keep them as long as you need. Some of them were my favorites when I was young. Some belong to my wife. All of them are here to be read, not just displayed. Micah's eyes went wide as he scanned the shelves. Any book? Any book. Though, if you want recommendations, I might suggest starting with these. Gideon stood and moved to a particular section, pulling down several volumes. Treasure Island, The Count of Monte Cristo, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Adventure stories about people who faced impossible situations and found ways to survive and thrive. He handed the books to Micah, who accepted them with reverence. I'll take really good care of them, the boy promised. I know you will. But even if something happens, if a book gets damaged or lost, that's okay. Books are meant to be read, lived with, loved. They're not museum pieces. They were settling back into homework when Edmund appeared in the doorway with an expression that Gideon recognized immediately. His butler's diplomatic face, the one he wore when delivering news that required careful handling. Sir, your son is here, Edmund announced. Mr. Richard. He's waiting in the drawing room and asking to speak with you urgently. Gideon felt his jaw tighten. Richard was his oldest child, 48 years old and perpetually disappointed that his father was still alive and in control of the Vale fortune. Their relationship had been strained for years, degrading further after Helen's death, when Richard had suggested, strongly, repeatedly, that Gideon should step down from active management of his companies and enjoy his retirement while Richard took over the business empire. Translation: let me start spending the money now rather than waiting for you to die. Tell him I'll be there shortly, Gideon said, then turned to Micah. I need to speak with someone. You keep working on your homework. If you need anything, Edmund will help you. He found Richard in the drawing room, pacing before the fireplace with barely contained agitation. His son was dressed in his typical uniform, expensive suit, designer shoes, watch that cost more than most people's cars, and radiated the kind of frustration that came from having every material advantage, but not the one thing he wanted most: control. Father, Richard said, the word clipped and formal. We need to talk. Hello, Richard. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? I received a call from Edmund this morning about some unusual financial transactions. Large checks being written, arrangements being made for property transfers, employment contracts being modified. Richard stopped pacing and fixed Gideon with a look that probably intimidated his subordinates but had never worked on his father. What's going on? I'm helping someone, Gideon said simply. A woman who works for me and her son. They needed assistance, and I'm providing it. Assistance! Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. Father, you wrote a $20,000 check to a maid you hired 2 weeks ago. You're giving her free housing in a Cambridge property worth over $1 million. You're paying for private school tuition for her kid. That's not assistance, that's hemorrhaging money to strangers. She's not a stranger, and it's my money to spend as I see fit. Not if you're being taken advantage of. Richard's voice rose. Don't you see what's happening here? This woman and her son show up, perform some sob story about medical debt and poverty, and suddenly you're writing checks and transferring property like you're trying to empty your accounts before you die. Watch your tone, Gideon said quietly, but with enough steel that Richard actually stepped back. You're talking about people you've never met, making assumptions about their character based on nothing but your own cynicism. I'm being realistic. Father, please, think about this rationally. You've spent the last 3 years paranoid about employees stealing from you, firing people left and right because you don't trust anyone. And now suddenly you're giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars to a maid and her kid? Either you're being conned or you're... He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. Or I'm what? Gideon's voice was dangerously calm. Losing my mental faculties? Becoming senile? Unable to make sound decisions about my own money? I didn't say that. You were about to. Gideon crossed to the window, looking out at the grounds where he'd once walked with Helen, back when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of threat. Let me tell you what actually happened, Richard. I set a trap for this woman and her son. I staged a test designed to prove they were dishonest, that everyone steals if given the opportunity. And they didn't just pass my test, they demolished it so completely that I had to face the fact that I'd become someone your mother wouldn't recognize. He turned back to face his son. Maria's 7-year-old son saw what he thought was a sleeping old man who looked cold, and he gave him his own jacket even though he was cold himself. He saw money that could have changed his life, and he protected it instead of taking it. He offered his father's toy car, the only thing he had left from his dead father, as payment for a debt that didn't even exist. And I realized that I'd spent 3 years testing people to prove they were rotten when the only rotten person in the room was me. Richard stared at him. So because a kid put a jacket on you, you're giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars? No. Because that child showed me what integrity looks like when it actually costs something, I'm choosing to invest in his future and his mother's stability. There's a difference. Father, I'm begging you, please reconsider this. At least have the family lawyer review whatever arrangements you've made. Put some protections in place in case these people aren't who you think they are. I know exactly who they are, Gideon said firmly. They're people who've survived things you and I can't imagine with their kindness and tact. They're people who deserve a chance at stability. And I'm going to give them that chance whether you approve or not. Richard's face flushed with anger. And what about your actual family, your children, your grandchildren? We're supposed to inherit this estate, these properties, this fortune, and now you're giving it away to strangers? There it was, the real issue, finally out in the open. Not concern for Gideon's welfare or worry about being conned, but anxiety about inheritance, about the money Richard had been counting on since he was old enough to understand what wealth meant. You and your siblings will inherit exactly what you've earned, Gideon said coldly, which is more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. But you don't get to dictate how I spend my money while I'm alive, and you certainly don't get to interfere with my attempts to do something meaningful with it. Meaningful? Richard's laugh was bitter. You've ignored your grandchildren for 3 years. You skipped Christmas last year because you said you weren't in the mood for family. You've treated us like potential thieves, like enemies waiting for you to die so we can raid your accounts. But some random kid puts a jacket on you and suddenly you're Father of the Year? The accusation hit harder than Richard probably intended because it was partially true. Gideon had withdrawn from his family after Helen's death, had turned holidays into obligations he avoided, had viewed his children and grandchildren through the same suspicious lens he'd turned on everyone else. But instead of shame, what Gideon felt was clarity. You're right, he said quietly. I have neglected you all. I turned into someone bitter and suspicious and isolated, and it took a 7-year-old boy I barely know to show me that I was destroying myself with my own paranoia. So yes, I'm helping him and his mother. And maybe if you're interested in actually being part of my life instead of just waiting to inherit from it, we could work on rebuilding our relationship too. But that would require you to care about something other than the money. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Richard looked like he wanted to say more, to argue or defend himself or continue fighting, but something in Gideon's expression must have convinced him that this battle was already lost. I hope you know what you're doing, Richard finally said. I don't, Gideon admitted, but I'm doing it anyway, which is probably healthier than the certainty I've been living with. After Richard left, not quite slamming the door but closing it firmly enough to make his displeasure clear, Gideon returned to the library to find Micah exactly where he'd left him, working diligently on homework. Edmund stood nearby, and the butler's slight nod told Gideon that he'd heard at least part of the confrontation with Richard. "Everything okay?" Micah asked, looking up from his reading comprehension worksheet. "Everything's fine," Gideon assured him, settling back into the chair beside the boy's table. "Just some family business. Nothing for you to worry about." But as he helped Micah work through the rest of his homework, Gideon found himself thinking about Richard's accusations and recognizing uncomfortable truths within them. He had neglected his actual family. He had treated them with suspicion and distance. And now he was pouring energy and resources into this woman and child he barely knew. Was that wrong? Was he overcompensating, swinging too far in the opposite direction from his previous paranoia? He glanced at Micah, watching the boy's face scrunch in concentration as he sounded out a difficult word, and felt the answer settle in his chest with unexpected certainty. No. This wasn't overcompensation. This was choosing to invest in people who'd proven their character under pressure, who'd shown kindness when it cost them everything they had. Richard had grown up with every advantage, had been given education and opportunity and wealth, and had turned into someone who measured relationships in dollars and viewed his father's generosity toward others as theft from his own future inheritance. Micah had grown up with nothing, had lived in shelters and moldy apartments, had learned to be invisible to survive, and had still chosen to give a cold stranger his only jacket. Character wasn't something you could buy with private schools and trust funds. It was something you either had or didn't have when the test came, and Micah had passed a test he didn't even know he was taking. "Mr. Vale?" Micah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That man who was here, was he mad at you because of me and Mama?" Gideon felt his chest tighten at the boy's perceptiveness. "What makes you think that?" "I heard him say something about giving money to strangers, and we're kind of strangers, I guess. We just met you on Friday." Micah's voice was small, worried. "If we're making problems with your family, we could leave. We don't want to cause trouble." "Listen to me," Gideon said, turning in his chair to face the boy directly. "You're not causing problems. That man is my son, and yes, he's concerned about some decisions I'm making. But those concerns are his to work through, not yours to fix. You and your mother are here because I want you here, because you taught me something important, because I want to help. That's my choice, my decision, and nobody else gets to make it for me. Do you understand?" Micah nodded slowly, but uncertainty still clouded his eyes. "Good. Now finish that reading worksheet so we can talk about the books I lent you. Have you decided which one you want to start with?" The worry faded from Micah's face as he returned to safer topics, to homework and adventure novels, and the simple pleasure of having a warm place to study. And Gideon sat beside him, helping with vocabulary words and grammar questions, and realized that this quiet afternoon of homework help and book recommendations felt more meaningful than any board meeting or financial triumph he'd experienced in years. Outside, the afternoon light was fading toward evening, painting the library in shades of gold and amber. The restored toy car gleamed on Micah's shelf, its gold wheel catching the light like a promise that broken things could be made whole again. And for the first time since Helen's death, Gideon felt something unclenching in his chest, some tight fist of grief and anger and suspicion finally beginning to open. It hurt, the way blood flowing back into numb limbs hurts, but it was a good hurt, a healing hurt. The kind of hurt that meant he was still alive, still capable of growth, still able to choose a different path than the one his pain had carved out for him. Maria returned an hour later with Edmund, her arms full of paperwork and keys, and her face showing equal parts exhaustion and exhilaration. "The apartment is beautiful," she told Gideon quietly, while Micah packed up his homework. "I can't believe that's going to be our home." "Believe it," Gideon said. "You've earned it through years of working harder than anyone should have to work just to survive. Consider this simply the world catching up with what you deserved all along." As they prepared to leave, Micah carrying his new books carefully against his chest, the boy paused at the door and looked back at Gideon. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked. "After school?" "Every day," Gideon confirmed. "This is your space now. Your table, your shelf, your books. Come whenever you want." "Thank you, Mr. Vale." Micah smiled, that transformative expression that made him look genuinely 7 instead of prematurely ancient. For everything. After they left, Gideon stood in the empty library, listening to the silence that had been his companion for 3 years. But it sounded different now, less like isolation and more like possibility, less like an ending and more like a space waiting to be filled with new voices, new purposes, new meanings. Edmund appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with Gideon's evening whiskey, a ritual they'd maintained through the darkest years. "That went well, I think," the butler observed mildly, setting the glass on Gideon's desk. "Richard didn't think so. Mr. Richard has his mother's business acumen, but unfortunately lacks her heart." Edmund's tone was diplomatically neutral, but after 40 years, Gideon could read the subtext. "Mrs. Vale would have approved of what you're doing. She would have done it 3 years ago, before I wasted all this time being angry at the world." "Perhaps, but she also would have said that it's never too late to choose differently, to become who you're meant to be rather than who your pain has made you." Edmund moved toward the door, then paused. "The boy is special, sir. Anyone can see that. You've chosen well." After Edmund left, Gideon sat at his desk and picked up the toy car, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, studying the gold wheel that represented repair and restoration and the possibility of wholeness after breaking. Tomorrow, Micah would return, and the day after that, and the day after that. And slowly, incrementally, Gideon would learn what it meant to be part of someone's life without suspicion or tests, to give without expecting return, to trust without demanding proof. It wouldn't be easy. 3 years of paranoia couldn't be undone overnight. Richard's concerns, however self-serving, reflected legitimate questions about judgment and vulnerability. There would be challenges ahead, complications, moments when doubt crept back in. But tonight, in a library that finally felt alive again, Gideon made a choice. He chose to believe that some people were good even when goodness cost them everything. He chose to invest in potential rather than protect against imaginary threats. He chose to honor the lesson a 7-year-old boy had taught him about kindness and sacrifice and the kind of wealth that couldn't be counted in bank accounts. He chose, quite simply, to live again instead of merely existing in the elaborate tomb he'd built from his grief. And as the November darkness settled over Vale Manor, Gideon Vale felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but its precursor. Hope. Hope, Gideon discovered over the following months, was both easier and harder than he'd anticipated. Easier because Micah arrived every afternoon like clockwork, filling the library with the particular energy of a child who'd finally found a safe harbor after years of drift. Harder because hope required him to dismantle the elaborate defense systems he'd spent 3 years constructing, not just the physical cameras and locks, but the psychological barriers that had kept him insulated from genuine human connection. By February, Vale Manor had undergone a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd known it during the dark years. The library, once a silent mausoleum of leather and mahogany, now echoed with Micah's questions about history and science, and why the ocean stayed salty even when it rained fresh water. Gideon's desk, formerly occupied solely by financial reports and surveillance footage, now shared space with Micah's science fair project, a working model of the water cycle that the boy had built with meticulous care and boundless enthusiasm. Maria had flourished too, the haunted wariness gradually fading from her eyes as stability replaced the constant anxiety of potential eviction and unpaid bills. She'd begun taking online classes in accounting, studying at night after Micah went to bed, pursuing the education she'd deferred when her husband got sick. Gideon had offered to pay for traditional college courses, but she'd insisted on starting slowly, proving to herself she could handle the workload before accepting more help. "I need to know I earned it," she'd explained, and Gideon had understood. Some people needed to prove their worth to themselves before they could accept that others already saw it. Edmund had observed these changes with quiet approval, occasionally mentioning to Gideon that the house feels alive again, sir, the way it did when Mrs. Vale was here. The butler had even begun leaving out cookies in the library, claiming they were left over from lunch preparations, but timing them perfectly for Micah's afternoon arrival. But not everyone had embraced the transformation. Richard had visited twice more since that first confrontation, each time with new concerns about financial irregularities and questionable decisions. His sister Patricia had joined the campaign, though her approach was less confrontational, worried phone calls about Gideon's emotional state, and gentle suggestions that he might be trying to replace the grandchildren you've been neglecting with someone else's child. The accusations stung partly because they contained fragments of truth. Gideon had neglected his biological grandchildren, had turned holidays into obligations he avoided, had treated family gatherings as ordeals to be endured rather than opportunities for connection. And yes, the energy he now poured into Micah's education and well-being was energy he'd never quite managed to summon for his own descendants. But the difference, Gideon had come to understand, wasn't about replacement or favoritism. It was about reciprocity. His grandchildren had been raised with every advantage, given trust funds and private schools and European vacations, and had learned to view these things as entitlements rather than gifts. They visited Vale Manor with the obligatory frequency of people checking items off a duty list, never with genuine interest in their grandfather as a person rather than a future inheritance. Micah visited because he wanted to be there, because he was genuinely curious about the world and saw Gideon as a source of knowledge and wisdom rather than wealth, because he'd learned early that kindness and attention were gifts to be treasured, not commodities to be taken for granted. It was late February when the situation came to a head, though Gideon didn't recognize the warning signs until it was too late to prevent the confrontation. He was in the library with Micah, helping the boy prepare for an upcoming spelling bee at his new school. The child had made remarkable academic progress in just 4 months. His teachers reported that he was reading 2 grade levels ahead and showing particular aptitude in mathematics and science. The scholarship Gideon had arranged had placed Micah in an environment where his intelligence was nurtured rather than merely accommodated, and the boy was blooming under the attention. Perseverance, Gideon said, reading from the word list. Can you use it in a sentence? Micah thought for a moment, chewing his pencil eraser in the way that always made Gideon smile. Mama says perseverance means you keep trying even when things are really hard. Like when we didn't have a home, but she kept working and kept believing we'd find somewhere safe. The sentence was more than just spelling practice. It was autobiography, and it never failed to humble Gideon when Micah casually referenced experiences that should have broken any child's spirit, but had somehow left this one intact. Perfect, Gideon said, both the spelling and the understanding. Next word. Benevolent. They were midway through the list when Edmund appeared in the doorway with an expression Gideon had learned to read with concern. His butler's diplomatic face had been replaced by something more troubled. Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but you have visitors. Mr. Richard, Ms. Patricia, and Mr. James have arrived together. They're quite insistent about speaking with you immediately. All 3 of his children arriving unannounced and en masse. This was coordinated, planned, and undoubtedly unpleasant. Tell them I'll be there shortly, Gideon said, then turned to Micah. I need to handle some family business. Why don't you keep working on the word list and we'll review when I get back? But as Gideon stood to leave, Micah's hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve. Mr. Vale? Are they mad about me again? The boy's perceptiveness was sometimes painful. They're concerned about some decisions I've made, but that's not for you to worry about. But if they're mad because you're helping me and Mama, Micah. Gideon knelt beside the boy's chair, bringing himself to eye level. Listen to me very carefully. What I do with my time and my resources is my decision, not theirs, not anyone else's. And I've chosen to invest in you and your mother because you've shown me what integrity and kindness look like when they actually cost something. That choice is mine, and I'm not going to let anyone make me regret it. Do you understand? Micah nodded, but worry still clouded his young face, and Gideon felt a surge of anger at his children for putting that expression there. He found all 3 of them in the drawing room, arranged like opposing counsel at a deposition. Richard stood by the fireplace, radiating barely controlled frustration. Patricia sat in one of the wing chairs, her designer purse clutched in her lap like a shield. James, the youngest at 42, paced near the windows, unable to maintain the stillness his siblings managed. This is an unexpected reunion, Gideon said, deliberately choosing not to sit, maintaining the psychological advantage of standing while they arranged themselves around the room. To what do I owe the pleasure of having all 3 of my children descend on me simultaneously? We need to talk about what's happening here, Richard said, abandoning any pretense of social niceties. About the decisions you've been making. About that woman and her son. Maria and Micah, Gideon corrected coldly. They have names. Use them. Fine. Maria and Micah. Richard's tone made the names sound like accusations. Father, in the past 4 months, you've spent over $100,000 on them. Private school tuition, medical expenses, housing, clothing, food, entertainment. You've modified your will to include provisions for the boys' college education. You've created a trust fund that guarantees Maria employment and housing for the next 20 years, regardless of her job performance. You've essentially adopted them financially while completely neglecting your actual family. I've neglected no one, Gideon said. You're all adults with substantial trust funds and successful careers. You lack for nothing. Except a father who shows up for family events, Patricia interjected, her voice carrying the particular hurt of a daughter who'd stopped expecting better but never stopped hoping. You missed Christmas again, Dad. Your granddaughter Hannah asked me why Grandpa doesn't love us anymore. What was I supposed to tell her? The accusation landed with precision, hitting the vulnerable places Gideon had been trying to armor against exactly this kind of attack. He had missed Christmas, had sent expensive gifts but avoided the actual gathering, unable to face the hollow performance of family unity when Helen wasn't there to make it genuine. I sent gifts, he managed weakly. Gifts. Patricia's laugh was hollow. You sent a check, Dad. You didn't even sign the card yourself. Edmund signed it. Your 8-year-old granddaughter got a check for $1,000 with your secretary's signature, while some kid you met 4 months ago gets your time and attention and genuine affection. Can you understand why that might hurt? I'm sorry you feel neglected, Gideon said carefully. But my relationship with Micah doesn't diminish what I'm willing to offer you if you're interested in actually building a relationship rather than just monitoring my bank accounts. That's not fair, James said, speaking for the first time. Unlike his siblings, he'd maintained a somewhat warmer relationship with Gideon over the years, calling occasionally to talk about business or sports or nothing in particular. We're not here just about money, Dad. We're worried about you. This whole situation, it doesn't make sense. You spent 3 years after Mom died suspicious of everyone, firing people for minor infractions, installing security cameras everywhere. And then suddenly you meet this woman and her kid, and within a week you're writing massive checks and transferring property and treating them like family. Can you see why that's concerning? What I see, Gideon said slowly, is that my wife's death broke something in me, and I responded by deciding the entire world was rotten and untrustworthy. I was wrong. Micah showed me I was wrong. And yes, I'm trying to make amends for 3 years of paranoid isolation by helping people who deserve help. If that concerns you, I'm sorry. But I'm not going to apologize for finally doing something meaningful with the wealth I've accumulated. But why them? Richard's voice rose with genuine confusion. Why this random woman and her kid? There are charities, foundations, established organizations that help people in need. If you want to be philanthropic, fine, but why pour all this money and attention into 2 strangers when your actual family is… Because they're not strangers anymore. Gideon's voice cracked like thunder, silencing his son mid-sentence. Because Micah gave me his jacket when he was cold and I wasn't. Because he protected money he desperately needed instead of taking it. Because when I demanded payment for damage that didn't exist, that child offered me his dead father's toy car, the only thing he had left of the man, rather than let his mother suffer. Because in one afternoon, a 7-year-old boy showed me more genuine kindness than I've experienced in 3 years of loneliness and suspicion. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Patricia looked like she might cry. James had stopped pacing and was staring at his father with an expression somewhere between understanding and hurt. Richard's face had gone red, his jaw clenched so tightly Gideon could see the muscles jumping. So that's it? Richard finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. Some kid performs a few nice gestures and suddenly he's more important to you than your own children? Your own grandchildren? That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. Richard's control shattered completely. You just admitted that this kid you barely know showed you more kindness than your own family. Maybe that's because we're not performing for you, Dad. We're not putting on shows of poverty and gratitude to manipulate you into opening your wallet. We're just being ourselves, flawed, complicated, sometimes disappointing human beings who happen to be your children. And apparently that's not good enough anymore. You want to talk about performance? Gideon's voice dropped to the cold, measured tone that had made boardroom opponents reconsider their positions. Let's talk about the fact that none of you have visited me in the past 4 months, except to complain about my financial decisions. Let's talk about how you didn't call on my birthday, didn't invite me to Thanksgiving, didn't include me in any family plans unless you needed something signed or approved. You accuse Micah of performing, but at least his kindness is genuine. At least when he asks how I'm doing, he actually cares about the answer instead of treating it as preamble to requesting a favor. That's not fair, Patricia protested, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. We stopped reaching out because you made it clear you didn't want to be reached. You turned down every invitation, ignored every overture. What were we supposed to do? Keep begging for scraps of attention from a father who acted like spending time with his family was a punishment? The words hit Gideon like physical blows because they were true. He had turned down invitations, had treated family gatherings as obligations, had made it clear through his absence and disinterest that he preferred isolation to connection. But acknowledging that truth meant acknowledging something larger and more painful, that he'd failed his children long before Helen's death, had prioritized business and wealth building over relationships, had given them money and advantages but withheld the genuine presence they'd actually needed. You're right, he said quietly, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. I've been a terrible father, not just for the past 3 years, but for much longer. I prioritized work over family, money over meaning. I gave you trust funds instead of time. And when your mother died, instead of drawing closer to you, I withdrew completely. I'm sorry for that, genuinely sorry. The apology seemed to surprise all 3 of them. Patricia wiped her eyes, mascara smudging across her fingers. James sank into a chair, looking exhausted. Richard remained standing, but some of the rigid anger in his posture had softened. But, Gideon continued, that doesn't change the fact that Micah and Maria deserve help, and I'm going to continue providing it. If you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that, genuinely open. But you don't get to make helping them conditional on neglecting you. The world isn't zero-sum. I have enough resources and time for everyone. Do you, though? Richard's question was quieter now, less accusatory. Dad, you're 75 years old. None of us know how much time we have, but statistically, you're closer to the end than the beginning, and you're spending that time with someone else's family while yours is... His voice cracked slightly. While we're right here. Available. Willing. The vulnerability in Richard's voice, so rare, so carefully hidden beneath layers of business acumen and financial aggression, made Gideon see his oldest son clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as a threat to his autonomy or a greedy heir circling a dying patriarch, but as a middle-aged man trying to reconcile with a father who'd always been emotionally distant and had become completely unavailable after losing his wife. I hear you, Gideon said, and you're right. I have been prioritizing Micah over you, partly because he needed it more urgently, partly because helping him felt like redemption for years of being the kind of person your mother warned me I was becoming. But also, he paused, trying to find words for something he'd barely admitted to himself. Also because it was easier. Easier to build something new with people who didn't know the worst versions of me than to repair relationships with people who'd watched me fail them for decades. So what now? James asked. Where do we go from here? Before Gideon could answer, a small voice came from the doorway. Mr. Vale? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard yelling, and I wanted to make sure you were okay. They all turned to see Micah standing in the entrance to the drawing room, his spelling list clutched in one hand, his expression showing the particular worry of a child who'd learned that raised voices often preceded disaster. I'm fine, Micah, Gideon said gently. Just having a difficult conversation with my children. Nothing for you to worry about. But Richard was staring at the boy with an intensity that made Gideon tense. His oldest son crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from Micah, studying him as if looking for evidence of deception or manipulation. So you're Micah, Richard said, his tone neutral but not hostile. The boy who's caused all this upheaval. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Micah said quietly, and Gideon could hear the fear beneath the words. I just wanted to help Mr. Vale when I thought he was cold. I didn't know it would make his family mad. We're not mad at you, Patricia said quickly, standing and moving closer. We're trying to understand what's happening. Why our father suddenly cares more about you than he does about his own grandchildren. Patricia, Gideon warned, but Micah was already responding. He doesn't care more about me, the boy said with the simple directness of someone too young to navigate adult political complexity. He just cares about me in a way he can show because I'm here and you're not. And maybe because I needed help really bad and you probably don't. Because you have nice clothes and you smell like expensive perfume and your purse probably costs more than Mama used to make in a whole month. The observation was delivered without malice, just factual assessment from a child who'd learned to read wealth and poverty in the details most people overlooked. Patricia looked down at her designer purse as if seeing it for the first time, her expression complicated. You're very perceptive, she said softly. I have to be, Micah replied. When you don't have money, you have to notice things. You have to understand people, so you know who's safe and who's not. Mr. Vale is safe. He's kind. He helped me and Mama when we had nothing. So when I heard people yelling at him, I wanted to make sure he was okay because he makes sure I'm okay every day. Richard made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Out of the mouths of babes, he muttered, then looked at Gideon. He's defending you. This kid you met 4 months ago is defending you against your own children. Because he knows I'll defend him too, Gideon said quietly. That's what people do when they care about each other. They show up. They check on each other. They protect each other when they need it. The implication was clear, unlike what we've been doing for years, and all 3 of his children heard it. James stood abruptly and crossed to where Micah stood in the doorway. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, and extended his hand formally. Hello, Micah. I'm James, Mr. Vale's youngest son. It's nice to meet you properly. Micah shook his hand cautiously. Nice to meet you too, sir. My daughter is about your age, James continued, 7.5. Her name is Sophie. Maybe sometime you could meet her. She's always looking for kids to play with, and I think she'd like you. The olive branch was unexpected, and Gideon felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Micah glanced at Gideon, seeking permission or guidance, and Gideon nodded. I'd like that, Micah said. I don't have a lot of friends yet at my new school. Everyone's nice, but they've all known each other forever, and I'm new. Sophie's great at making new people feel welcome, James assured him. We'll set something up. Patricia was crying again, but differently now. Not from hurt or anger, but from something more complex. She approached Micah slowly, carefully, as if approaching a small animal that might startle. I'm Patricia, she said, and I owe you an apology. I said some things about you that weren't fair, made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I'm sorry for that. It's okay, Micah said with the easy forgiveness of children who haven't yet learned to hold grudges. You were worried about your dad. That makes sense. I'd be worried too if I thought someone was taking advantage of someone I loved. The simple acceptance seemed to break something in Patricia. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting for control, then looked at Gideon with an expression that conveyed everything she couldn't say: regret, understanding, a tentative offer of reconciliation. Richard remained standing by the fireplace, arms crossed, but his posture had shifted from defensive to contemplative. He studied Micah for a long moment, then looked at his father. I still think you're making questionable financial decisions, he said bluntly. I still think you're being too generous too quickly with people you barely know. But, he paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. But I can see why you care about them, and maybe that's what matters more than whether the decisions make perfect financial sense. It was as close to approval as Richard was likely to offer, and Gideon accepted it as the peace offering it was meant to be. Thank you, he said simply. The tension in the room had shifted from confrontational to awkwardly conciliatory, everyone uncertain how to navigate this new dynamic. It was Micah who broke the uncomfortable silence, holding up his spelling list. I should probably get back to studying, he said. The spelling bee is next week and I still need to practice. I'll walk you back to the library, Gideon said, grateful for the excuse to exit and let his children process what had just transpired. But before they left, he turned back to his children. Stay, please. We can have dinner together, actually talk instead of just arguing about money and decisions. If you're willing, Patricia nodded immediately. James agreed with a warm smile. Richard hesitated, then gave a curt nod that Gideon chose to interpret as acceptance. As Gideon walked Micah back to the library, the boy was quiet, processing the confrontation he'd accidentally interrupted. When they reached the table where his spelling list and books waited, Micah looked up at Gideon with concern. "Are you really okay?" he asked. "I know you said you were, but grown-ups sometimes say they're okay when they're not." Gideon sat down heavily in the chair beside Micah's table, suddenly feeling every one of his 75 years. "I'm okay," he said. "Better than okay, actually. That was hard, but it was probably necessary. My children and I have needed to have that conversation for a long time. You just happened to be the catalyst that finally forced it." "Catalyst," Micah repeated. "That's a good word. Does it mean like the thing that makes other things happen?" "Exactly. In chemistry, a catalyst is a substance that causes a reaction without being consumed by it. You walked into my life and catalyzed changes that needed to happen, but that I'd been avoiding. You helped me see who I'd become and gave me a reason to become someone better." "That's a lot of responsibility for a 7-year-old, Micah observed, and despite the tension of the afternoon, Gideon found himself smiling. "It is. Too much, probably. Which is why I need you to remember something important. You're not responsible for fixing me or my family. You're not responsible for justifying my decisions to my children or proving your worth to anyone. You're 7. Your job is to study for spelling bees and read adventure novels and be a kid. All the complicated adult stuff is mine to handle, not yours. Understand?" Micah nodded, relief visible in his posture. "Okay, but I can still check on you if I hear yelling, right?" "You can still check on me," Gideon confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair in a gesture that had become comfortable between them. "Now, let's run through that word list one more time before Maria comes to pick you up." They worked through the words together, and Gideon found himself marveling at how this had become his life. Spelling practice in the afternoon, genuine connection with someone who asked nothing beyond presence and kindness, the slow rebuilding of bridges he'd burned in his grief and isolation. When Maria arrived to collect Micah, Gideon pulled her aside briefly. "My children were here today," he said quietly. "There was a confrontation. Some things were said. I want you to know that regardless of what pressures they might try to apply, my commitment to you and Micah is unwavering. This is not contingent on their approval." Maria studied his face carefully. "Are you sure? Family is complicated, Mr. Vale. If helping us is damaging your relationship with your children—" "It's not," Gideon interrupted gently. "Or rather, it's forcing repairs to relationships that were already damaged. That's different, and it's my responsibility to navigate, not yours." She nodded slowly, though concern still shadowed her expression. "If you're sure, I'm sure." After they left, Gideon returned to the drawing room where his children waited, still arranged awkwardly in the space, uncertain how to proceed. Edmund had set out drinks and appetizers, professional as always, and had disappeared to give them privacy. "Thank you for staying," Gideon said, settling into the chair Helen had favored for reading. "I know that wasn't easy." "Nothing about this is easy," Richard said bluntly. "But James was right earlier. We need to figure out where we go from here, not just with the Micah and Maria situation, but with us, with this family." So they talked, really talked, for the first time in years. Patricia shared how abandoned she'd felt when Gideon had withdrawn after Helen's death, how her mother's loss had been compounded by her father's emotional disappearance. James admitted he'd stopped trying to connect because every overture had been rejected, and eventually self-preservation had demanded he stop setting himself up for disappointment. Richard, with more difficulty, acknowledged that his focus on the financial aspects masked deeper hurt, that watching his father pour energy and resources into strangers felt like confirmation that Richard and his siblings had never been enough, had never earned that level of care. And Gideon listened, really listened, without defensiveness or justification, hearing the legitimate pain beneath the accusations. He apologized, genuinely, specifically, for failures spanning decades, not just years. He acknowledged that helping Micah and Maria had been easier than confronting his failures with his own family, that building something new was simpler than repairing something broken. "But I want to try," he said, as the evening shadows lengthened across the drawing room. To repair what's broken, if you're willing. It won't be quick, and I'll probably fail in new and creative ways, but I'm willing to try if you are. They didn't reach complete resolution that evening. Years of damage couldn't be undone in one conversation. But they reached something more valuable: honest acknowledgement of the problems and tentative commitment to addressing them. When his children finally left, long after dinner had been served and consumed in the dining room that hadn't hosted a family meal in 3 years, Gideon stood at the library window watching their cars wind down the long drive. The toy car sat on the windowsill beside him, its gold wheel catching the light from the reading lamp. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, thinking about catalysts and transformations and the strange alchemy that turned broken things into whole ones. Micah had given him this car as payment for a debt that didn't exist, willing to surrender his last connection to his father to protect his mother. And that sacrifice had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond one child and one old man, rippling outward to touch broken family relationships, to force confrontations that needed to happen, to create space for healing that had seemed impossible just months before. Edmund appeared in the doorway with Gideon's evening whiskey, the ritual maintained even on days of upheaval. "An eventful day, sir," the butler observed mildly. "That's one word for it," Gideon agreed, accepting the glass. "Edmund, do you think I'm making a mistake? Investing so much in Micah and Maria while my relationship with my own family is still so fractured?" Edmund considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think, sir, that you're doing what Mrs. Vale always hoped you would do, choosing connection over isolation, generosity over suspicion, love over fear. Whether that's a mistake depends entirely on whether you're willing to extend the same openness to your biological family that you've shown to your chosen one." "Chosen family, Thistle," Gideon repeated, testing the phrase. "Is that what they are?" "Isn't it?" Edmund's slight smile conveyed understanding. "Family isn't only about blood, sir. It's also about who shows up, who cares, who chooses to be present in your life with genuine affection rather than obligatory duty. Young Micah and his mother have become family through choice and care. That doesn't diminish your biological family. It expands it, if you'll allow it to." After Edmund left, Gideon sat in Helen's reading chair, sipping his whiskey and watching the last light fade from the sky. The library felt different now, not haunted by Helen's absence, but warmed by new presence. Micah's books on the shelf, his spelling list on the table, the science fair project still in progress on the desk. Evidence of life continuing, of purpose renewed, of connections formed. And tomorrow, Patricia had promised, she would bring Hannah over to meet Micah. James was arranging a playdate with Sophie. Richard had stiffly but genuinely invited Gideon to Sunday dinner with his family, the first such invitation extended in over a year. Broken things, Gideon thought, turning the toy car over in his hands one more time before setting it carefully back on the windowsill. Broken things could be made whole again if you were willing to do the work of restoration, to replace missing pieces with something precious, to polish away the damage until the beauty beneath could shine through. He'd been broken. His family had been broken. But maybe, with patience and effort and the willingness to be vulnerable, they could all roll smoothly forward again, not perfect, not without scars, but whole enough to keep moving. And that, Gideon realized, was exactly what healing looked like. The healing proved messier and more complicated than a single evening of honest conversation could resolve. Over the following months, as winter surrendered to spring, and the grounds of Vale Manor erupted in Helen's carefully planned gardens, Gideon found himself navigating the delicate balance between his biological family and the chosen family he'd unexpectedly acquired. Some days felt like progress, Sunday dinners with Richard's family, where actual conversation happened instead of stilted small talk, afternoons when Patricia brought Hannah to play with Micah, and the children's laughter filled rooms that had been silent for too long. Other days felt like regression, like when James canceled 3 scheduled visits in a row, citing work conflicts that sounded suspiciously like excuses, or when Richard made pointed comments about charitable expenditures during discussions about the family business. But Gideon persisted, applying the same determination to rebuilding relationships that he'd once applied to building his fortune. He showed up for Hannah's dance recital, even though he'd missed every such event for the past 3 years. He attended Sophie's soccer games, cheering from the sidelines, despite having no idea about the rules beyond the basic objective of getting the ball in the goal. He hosted family dinners at Vale Manor, insisting his children bring their spouses and children, filling the long dining table that had sat empty since Helen's death. And through it all, Micah remained a constant presence, arriving every afternoon with his backpack and his questions and his uncomplicated affection. The boy had won his school spelling bee, advanced to regionals, and eventually made it to the state competition where he'd placed third, an achievement that had him beaming with pride for weeks. His science fair project on the water cycle had earned first place in his grade, and the ribbon was now displayed prominently on his shelf beside his father's restored toy car. Maria had completed her first semester of online accounting courses with straight A's, juggling work and school and single motherhood with a grace that continued to humble Gideon. She'd begun contributing to the household in small ways that went beyond her contracted duties, arranging flowers from the garden for the library, baking cookies that reminded Gideon of his own childhood, suggesting small improvements to the house that made it feel more lived in and less like a museum. It was early June, nearly 8 months after the rainy November day that had changed everything, when Gideon's doctor delivered news that recontextualized all the healing and rebuilding with brutal efficiency. "The scans show a mass in your pancreas, doctor," Morrison said, her professional composure unable to fully mask the sympathy in her eyes. "We'll need a biopsy to confirm, but given the size and location, I'm fairly certain we're looking at pancreatic cancer, likely stage 3, possibly stage 4. The word should have hit like a bomb, should have detonated Gideon's carefully reconstructed world with the force of catastrophic revelation. Instead, they settled over him with an almost dreamlike quality, distant and surreal, as if happening to someone else while he observed from a great height. "Prognosis?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unreality of the moment. Dr. Morrison hesitated, and that hesitation told Gideon everything he needed to know before she spoke. "Pancreatic cancer is aggressive and difficult to treat, especially at advanced stages. With treatment, chemotherapy, possibly radiation, we might extend your timeline by several months, maybe a year. Without treatment, you're looking at perhaps 3 to 6 months. 3 to 6 months, the span of time between that rainy November afternoon and this June morning. The same amount of time he'd known Micah and Maria, rebuilt connections with his children, learned to live again instead of merely existing. "I need to think about treatment options," Gideon said. "Research the possibilities." "Of course, but Gideon—" Dr. Morrison leaned forward, dropping the professional distance for a moment of genuine human connection. "The treatment itself can be brutal. Significantly reduced quality of life, constant nausea, extreme fatigue, cognitive impacts. Some patients choose to forgo treatment and focus on making their remaining time as meaningful as possible. I'm not advocating for either choice, but I want you to understand the full picture before deciding." After the appointment, Gideon sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for nearly an hour, unable to quite process what he'd just learned. Dying. He was dying. Not in the abstract, eventually we all die sense, but concretely, measurably, in a time frame that could be counted in months rather than years. Helen had known she was dying, had lived with that knowledge for 18 months, watching the cancer metastasize despite aggressive treatment, feeling herself weaken incrementally until those final days when even breathing required effort. She'd faced it with remarkable grace, but Gideon remembered the fear in her eyes during the worst moments, the quiet terror of approaching an ending she wasn't ready for. And now it was his turn. The first person he told was Edmund, because the butler deserved to know, and because Edmund had navigated Helen's illness with Gideon and would understand the landscape they were entering. "I see," Edmund said quietly, when Gideon explained the diagnosis in the privacy of his study. "Have you decided on a treatment plan?" "Not yet. Morrison wants me to meet with an oncologist, explore options, but the prognosis isn't good regardless of treatment choice." "No, I don't imagine it is." Edmund was silent for a moment, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine grief. "Mrs. Vale would want you to fight. She'd insist on treatment, on extending every possible day." "Helen fought for 18 months and died anyway," Gideon said bluntly. "Spent her last year in hospitals and treatment centers. sick from the cure as much as the disease. I'm not sure that's how I want to spend whatever time I have left. What do you want, sir? It was a simple question with no simple answer. What did he want? 3 months ago, before the diagnosis, the answer would have been equally straightforward. More time with Micah, watching the boy grow and learn. More opportunities to repair relationships with his children and grandchildren. More chances to prove he could be the man Helen had believed he could become. But now, with the timeline, the question became more urgent. How did he want to spend 3 to 6 months? Or even 12 if he chose treatment and it worked better than expected? What mattered most when time became finite and precious? I want to tell my family, Gideon said finally, but I want to do it carefully, and I need to make sure certain arrangements are finalized first. Over the next week, Gideon met with his lawyers and financial advisors, updating his will and establishing trusts with a precision and thoroughness that would have made his business-minded children proud. The bulk of his estate would still go to Richard, Patricia, and James. They were his children, and despite their complicated relationships, he wanted them financially secure. But substantial provisions were made for Micah's education and future, ensuring the boy could attend any college he wanted without financial concern. A trust was established for Maria, guaranteeing her employment and housing security for life, not just the 20 years he'd previously arranged. And the mansion itself, Vale Manor with its Gothic architecture and clifftop views and library full of books, that he left to Micah, to be held in trust until the boy turned 25. Not because Gideon expected a child to maintain a massive estate, but because he wanted Micah to have the choice to keep it as a home, to sell it and use the money for whatever dreams he developed, to transform it into something entirely new. Helen had always said the house needed life in it, children running through its halls, laughter echoing off its stone walls. Gideon's own grandchildren had never quite filled that role, visiting dutifully but without genuine connection to the place. But Micah loved the library, felt safe within these walls, and Gideon wanted him to know that safety could be permanent if he chose. It took another week before Gideon felt ready to tell his family. He invited them all to dinner on a Sunday evening, Richard and his wife Lauren, Patricia and her husband David, James and his wife Amanda, and all 5 grandchildren. He didn't invite Maria and Micah, wanting to have this conversation with his biological family first, to give them space to react without audience. They gathered in the dining room, the children somewhat subdued by the formality of the occasion, sensing something important was happening even if they didn't understand what. Gideon waited until after the main course had been served and mostly consumed, until the wine had relaxed some of the adult tension, before he spoke. I asked you all here tonight because I have news to share, he began, setting down his fork with deliberate care. I was diagnosed recently with pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. The prognosis is not good, somewhere between 3 and 12 months, depending on whether I pursue treatment. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's wine glass slipped from her fingers, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. James made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Richard's face went completely blank. His practiced business expression automatically deployed to mask whatever he was feeling underneath. What kind of treatment are they recommending? Richard finally asked, his voice tight and controlled. Aggressive chemotherapy, possibly radiation, but the doctors have been honest that it's more about extending time than achieving cure. And the treatment itself would significantly impact quality of life. So you fight anyway, Richard said firmly. You do whatever treatment gives you the most time. We'll hire the best oncologists, go to the best cancer centers. Richard, Gideon interrupted gently, I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do. What do you mean you haven't decided? Patricia's voice was shrill with panic. Dad, you can't just give up. You have to fight. We just got you back. We just started rebuilding this family. You can't leave now. The raw pain in her voice made Gideon's chest ache. I'm not giving up. I'm considering my options. Your mother fought for 18 months, and it bought her time, yes, but it also cost her dearly. Every day was a battle against nausea, pain, exhaustion. I watched her suffer through treatments that made her miserable so she could have a few more months. I'm not sure that's what I want. What about what we want? James asked, tears streaming down his face unchecked. Don't we get a say in this? You're our father. We need you. The kids need you. You can't just decide to... He couldn't finish the sentence. Hannah, Patricia's 8-year-old daughter, spoke up from her seat at the children's end of the table. Grandpa, are you going to die? The question cut through all the adult circumlocution with childlike directness. Gideon looked at his granddaughter, this child he barely knew despite sharing DNA, this girl he'd ignored for 3 years and had only recently begun building a relationship with, and felt the full weight of what his illness meant for all the people in this room. Yes, sweetheart, he said gently. Eventually. Probably sooner than we'd like. But I'm still here now, and I plan to make the most of whatever time I have left. Is it because you're old? Hannah asked with the brutal honesty only children can deploy. Partly because I'm old, partly because I got sick. Sometimes our bodies just stop working the way they should. That's not fair, Hannah said, and her lower lip trembled. We just started having fun with you. You came to my dance recital and you said I was good. You can't die now. Patricia pulled her daughter close, both of them crying now, and the scene rippled outward. Sophie burying her face in James's shoulder, the older grandchildren looking stricken and uncertain. This was the cost of his reconnection, Gideon realized. By rebuilding these relationships, by letting people back in, he'd given them something precious that would now be taken away. Maybe it would have been kinder to maintain the distance, to let them continue not caring so the loss wouldn't hurt so much. But even as the thought formed, he rejected it. These months of connection, however brief, were worth the pain of losing them. For him, and he hoped, for his family too. I know it's not fair, Gideon said to Hannah, and I'm sorrier than I can say that we lost 3 years when I was too sad and angry to be a proper grandfather. But we have now. However much time that is, we have it, and I want to spend it with you, with all of you. Richard had regained some composure and was now in problem-solving mode. We need to schedule meetings with oncologists, get second opinions, research clinical trials. There might be experimental treatments. I'll consider all options, Gideon promised, but I need you to understand that the final decision is mine, and it might not be the decision you want me to make. Because of them, Richard said, and there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there moments before. Because of that woman and her son. You're planning to spend your last months playing grandfather to someone else's kid instead of getting treatment that could give you more time with your actual family. That's not fair, Patricia protested weakly, but Richard was building momentum. Isn't it? Dad just told us he's dying, and instead of immediately committing to treatment, to fighting for every possible day with us, he's hedging. Why? Because he'd rather spend his final months in that library with Micah than suffer through treatment to have more time with his grandchildren. That's what this is really about. You're wrong, Gideon said, his voice sharp enough to silence his son. This has nothing to do with Micah and everything to do with having watched your mother suffer through 18 months of brutal treatment that bought her time but cost her joy. I'm weighing quality against quantity, Richard. That's all. But Richard's accusation had planted a seed of doubt that Gideon could see taking root in his other children's expressions. Were they wrong? Was his hesitation about treatment influenced by knowing that treatment would limit his time and energy with Micah? Would he choose differently if the boy wasn't in his life? The dinner concluded awkwardly, his children leaving with promises to research treatment options and send him information, their earlier grief now mixed with something more complicated. Resentment, perhaps, or confusion about priorities. The grandchildren hugged him with desperate intensity, as if trying to memorize the feeling of his embrace against the day when it would no longer be available. After they left, Gideon stood in the library where Micah's books still lined the shelf and the science fair ribbons still hung beside the restored toy car. He picked up the car, turning it over in his hands, thinking about Richard's accusations and his own motivations. Was he choosing Micah over his biological family? Was that what this hesitation about treatment represented? The next afternoon, when Micah arrived for his usual homework session, Gideon found he couldn't quite maintain the pretense of normalcy. The boy settled at his table with his math worksheets, chattering about his day at school, and Gideon listened with an attention sharpened by mortality's proximity. Mr. Vale? Micah's voice cut through his thoughts. Are you okay? You seem sad today. Children, Gideon had learned, possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect emotional weather that adults worked hard to hide. I need to tell you something, Gideon said, and even as he spoke, he wondered if this was wise, if burdening a 7-year-old with knowledge of impending death was fair or appropriate. But Micah had already lost his father. He understood death in ways many children his age didn't, and Gideon had promised himself he wouldn't treat the boy as fragile or incapable of handling difficult truths. "I went to the doctor recently," Gideon began carefully, "and they found out I'm sick. Very sick. The kind of sick that doesn't get better." Micah's face went very still, his pencil frozen mid-equation. "Like how my daddy was sick?" "Yes. Like that. Are you going to die?" The question was asked in the same matter-of-fact tone Micah might use to ask about homework or dinner plans, but his hands gripped the pencil so tightly his knuckles were white. "Eventually, yes. Probably within the next year, maybe sooner." The boy's face crumpled, and suddenly he was out of his chair and throwing his arms around Gideon with the same desperate intensity Hannah had shown the night before. "No," Micah said, his voice muffled against Gideon's chest. "No, you can't. You're my... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't name what Gideon had become to him over these months. "I know," Gideon said, holding the boy close and feeling his own eyes burn with tears he wouldn't let fall. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for several minutes, Micah crying with the abandon of a child who'd already lost one person he loved and couldn't bear to lose another, Gideon holding him and wondering how many more goodbyes this boy would have to endure in his young life. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Micah pulled back and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. "Can the doctors fix it? Can you take medicine like Daddy did?" "There's medicine I could take, treatments I could try. But they wouldn't fix it, just maybe give me a little more time. And the treatments would make me very sick." "But more time is good," Micah said with the simple logic of someone for whom more time meant everything. "More time means more days in the library, more help with homework, more—" His voice broke. "More time before you leave." "You sound like my son Richard," Gideon said gently. "He wants me to fight too, to do every treatment possible." "Then you should," Micah said firmly. "You should fight. Please." Gideon looked at this child who'd given him so much, who'd returned kindness for his cynicism, warmth for his coldness, unconditional affection for his suspicious testing. Micah had already lost his father to cancer. Now he was facing the loss of someone who'd become a grandfather figure, a mentor, a safe harbor. Of course he wanted Gideon to fight, to squeeze out every possible day, to delay the inevitable as long as possible. But was that the right choice? The kind choice? To spend months sick and suffering so others could have a few more weeks of his diminished presence? "I'll think about it," Gideon promised. "I'll talk to the doctors, consider all my options carefully. But Micah, I need you to understand something. Whatever I decide, it's not because I don't care about you or don't want more time with you. It's because I'm trying to make the choice that lets me be the best version of myself for whatever time I have left. Do you understand?" Micah nodded, though his expression suggested he understood intellectually, but rejected it emotionally. They tried to return to homework, but the math problems seemed impossibly trivial, given the conversation they'd just had. Eventually, they abandoned the pretense and simply sat together, Micah leaning against Gideon's side while Gideon read aloud from Treasure Island, both of them taking comfort in the familiar ritual. Maria arrived to pick up Micah and immediately sensed something was wrong. Gideon pulled her aside and explained the diagnosis, watching her face cycle through shock, grief, and a complicated expression that might have been anger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked quietly. We could have... She stopped, unable to articulate what difference advance notice would have made. "I needed to tell my children first, and I needed to process it myself before I could talk about it." "Are you doing treatment?" "I don't know yet. Everyone wants me to fight, but I watched Helen fight, and I'm not sure that's what I want." Maria was silent for a long moment, her hand resting on Micah's shoulder as the boy stood pressed against her side. "My husband fought too," she said finally. "Fought so hard. Suffered through treatments that made him miserable. And in the end, he told me he regretted it. Said he wished he'd spent those months living instead of dying slowly in hospitals. Said he would have rather had 3 good months than 6 terrible ones." "That's what I keep thinking about," Gideon admitted, "whether quantity of time matters more than quality." "Only you can answer that," Maria said. But whatever you decide, Micah and we're here for whatever you need." After they left, Gideon returned to his study and opened the folder of medical information Dr. Morrison had provided. Treatment protocols, survival statistics, quality of life assessments. The numbers painted a bleak picture. Even with aggressive treatment, the 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer at his stage was less than 3%. Most patients died within 18 months, and those months were often dominated by treatment side effects rather than meaningful living. He thought about Helen, spending her final year in and out of hospitals, too weak from chemotherapy to enjoy the garden she loved, too nauseous to eat the foods that had once brought her pleasure. She'd fought because the doctors told her to fight, because giving up felt like failure, because she'd wanted every possible day with the people she loved. But in those final weeks, when the treatments had clearly failed and death was inevitable, she'd told Gideon she was tired of fighting, tired of suffering, ready to let go. He'd held her hand and told her it was okay to stop, that she'd fought hard enough, that she could rest. And she had entered hospice care and died peacefully a week later, surrounded by family, pain-managed but conscious, able to say goodbye with dignity. What if she'd made that choice earlier? What if instead of 18 months of treatment, she'd chosen 6 months of actually living? Would those 6 months have been richer, fuller, more meaningful than the 1.5 years of medical procedures and side effects? Over the next 2 weeks, Gideon met with oncologists and researched treatment protocols and listened to his children's increasingly desperate pleas for him to fight. Richard compiled data on survival rates and clinical trials. Patricia researched holistic approaches and alternative treatments. James simply begged him not to give up, to try whatever might work. And every afternoon, Micah arrived at the library and looked at Gideon with eyes that asked the same question: "Are you still here? Will you be here tomorrow?" The decision, when Gideon finally made it, felt both inevitable and impossible. He called his children to Vale Manor on a Thursday evening, along with Maria and Micah, wanting everyone to hear his choice simultaneously. "I've decided not to pursue aggressive treatment," he said once they were all gathered in the library. "I'll do palliative care to manage symptoms and pain, but I'm not doing chemotherapy or radiation. I'm choosing quality of time over quantity." The response was immediate and loud. Richard accused him of giving up, of choosing death over fighting for his family. Patricia cried and begged him to reconsider. James simply looked devastated, unable to speak through his grief. But it was Micah's reaction that cut deepest. The boy stood up from his usual table and looked at Gideon with an expression of such profound betrayal that Gideon felt it like a physical wound. "You're giving up," Micah said, his voice small but clear. "Just like you gave up on trusting people before I met you. You're choosing the easy way instead of fighting." "Micah," Gideon began, but the boy was already running from the room, Maria calling after him. In the chaos that followed, Maria chasing Micah, his children arguing and pleading, the grandchildren crying in confusion, Gideon sat in his chair and wondered if he'd made the right choice or the most selfish one. Was he choosing quality of life, or was he choosing to avoid the hard work of fighting because he'd already made peace with dying? He didn't have an answer, and as his family's grief and anger swirled around him in the library that had become his sanctuary, Gideon understood that some choices don't have right answers. They only have consequences that must be lived with, however long that living might be. Outside, the June evening was fading into dusk, and somewhere in the gardens Helen had planted, roses were blooming that she would never see. Inside, a family was fracturing around a decision one man had made about how to spend his final months on Earth. And on the windowsill, a toy car with a gold wheel gleamed in the fading light, a reminder that broken things could be made whole again, but also that some kinds of breaking couldn't be fixed no matter how much gold you had. The days following Gideon's announcement moved with the strange, distorted quality of time under pressure, simultaneously crawling and racing. Each moment weighted with significance while also slipping away too quickly to properly hold. Micah didn't come to the library the next day, or the day after that. Maria sent apologetic text messages explaining that her son was struggling to process the news, that he'd locked himself in his room and refused to talk about it, that she was giving him space to work through his grief in his own way. Gideon understood. He'd done the same thing after Helen's death, hadn't he? Locked himself away emotionally, if not physically, refusing connection because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. He'd spent 3 years in that self-imposed isolation before a 7-year-old boy with a wet jacket had broken through his defenses. Now that same boy was building his own walls, and Gideon had no idea how to scale them. His biological children had responded to his decision with varying degrees of acceptance. Richard had gone cold and distant, communicating only through terse emails about business matters and estate logistics. Patricia called daily, still trying to persuade him to reconsider, sending articles about miracle remissions and experimental treatments. James had simply stopped responding entirely, his silence more painful than Richard's anger or Patricia's desperate hope. The grandchildren, too young to understand the complexities but old enough to sense the family tension, had become subdued during visits, their previous enthusiasm dampened by the adult's grief. It was Edmund who finally forced Gideon to confront what his decision was costing him. "Sir, with respect, you're making a mistake," the butler said one evening as he delivered Gideon's whiskey, a ritual that had survived Helen's death and would apparently survive Gideon's own approaching mortality. "About the treatment?" Gideon asked, though he knew that wasn't what Edmund meant. "About isolation. You chose not to pursue aggressive treatment because you wanted quality time rather than quantity. But you're spending that quality time alone, alienated from both families, biological and chosen. That's not quality. That's just another form of the isolation you lived in before Micah arrived." The observation stung because it was accurate. "They're angry with me. Micah feels betrayed. My children think I'm giving up. What am I supposed to do?" "Fight for them the way they wanted you to fight the cancer," Edmund said simply. "Show up, be present, make them understand that choosing how to die doesn't mean you've stopped choosing how to live." So Gideon began showing up. He went to Richard's house unannounced and sat at his oldest son's kitchen table until Richard agreed to talk. The conversation was painful, full of accusations and hurt on both sides, but it ended with Richard admitting that his anger was really fear of losing his father just as they'd begun to rebuild their relationship, fear that he'd waited too long to reconcile and would now run out of time. "I'm afraid too," Gideon had admitted. "Terrified, actually. But I can't spend whatever time I have left being sick from treatments that probably won't work. I need you to understand that this isn't giving up. It's choosing how I want to spend my final months. With you, if you'll let me. But on my terms." Richard had cried then, something Gideon hadn't seen his son do since childhood, and they'd held each other in that kitchen while years of distance and resentment slowly dissolved into something more honest and raw and real. Patricia had been easier to reach, her desperate hope transforming into fierce determination to make every remaining day count. She started bringing Hannah over 3 times a week instead of once, filling the library with her daughter's energy and questions. She asked Gideon to tell stories about Helen, about his own childhood, about the building of his business empire, creating an oral history that Hannah recorded on her iPad, preserving her grandfather's voice and memories for a future when he wouldn't be there to share them. James took longer to come around, his silence stretching for 2 full weeks before he finally appeared at Vale Manor on a Saturday morning, red-eyed and exhausted. "I can't lose you," he'd said simply. "I can't lose you the way we lost Mom. I'm not strong enough." "You're stronger than you know," Gideon had replied. "And you're not losing me yet. I'm still here. Let's not waste the time we have left being afraid of the time we don't have." But Micah remained absent, and his absence created a hollow ache in Gideon's chest that intensified with each empty afternoon in the library. The boy's books still lined the shelf. His spelling bee ribbon still hung beside the toy car. His table sat empty, homework free, a monument to connection interrupted. 3 weeks after his announcement, Gideon finally went to Maria and Micah's apartment in Cambridge, the 2-bedroom unit he'd provided, which he'd never actually visited because their arrangement had always been centered on Vale Manor. Maria answered the door looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd been sleeping as poorly as Gideon had. "He's in his room," she said quietly. "He knows you're here. I told him you were coming, but I can't promise he'll talk to you." "Can I try?" She nodded and stepped aside, gesturing toward a closed door decorated with a poster of the solar system. Gideon knocked gently. "Micah, it's Mr. Vale. Can I come in?" Silence. "I understand if you're angry with me. You have every right to be, but I'd like to talk to you if you'll let me." More silence, stretching long enough that Gideon was about to give up when the door opened a crack. Micah stood there, and the anger in his young face was almost harder to bear than his earlier tears. "You lied," the boy said. "You said broken things could be made whole again. You said you were going to try. But you're not trying. You're just giving up like my daddy did." "Your daddy didn't give up," Gideon said gently. "He fought as hard as he could for as long as he could. And when he realized the fighting was hurting more than helping, he made a choice about how he wanted to spend his final time. That's not giving up. That's being brave enough to choose quality over quantity." "But I want quantity." Micah's voice rose, all the grief and fear he'd been holding inside finally erupting. "I want more time. I want more days in the library and more help with homework and more everything. You're supposed to be here. You're supposed to—" His voice broke. "You're the only grandfather I have, and you're choosing to leave me." The words hit Gideon like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. He knelt down, bringing himself to Micah's eye level the way he'd done that first day in the library. "I'm not choosing to leave you," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Cancer is taking me away, and I can't stop that. But I can choose how I spend whatever time I have left. I can choose to spend it sick and suffering in hospitals so you get maybe a few more months of a grandfather who's too weak and nauseous to help with homework. Or I can choose to spend it actually being present, reading with you, talking with you, making memories that will last even after I'm gone." "But the doctor said treatment might give you a year," Micah argued with desperate logic. "A whole year is better than 6 months, even if you're sick sometimes." "Is it?" Gideon asked gently. "Micah, I watched my wife fight for 18 months. Watched her suffer through treatments that made her so sick she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't enjoy the things she loved. And at the very end, she told me she wished she'd stopped earlier. Wished she'd chosen 6 good months instead of 18 terrible ones. I'm trying to honor what she learned, what your father learned. Sometimes knowing when to stop fighting is its own kind of strength." Micah was crying now, angry tears streaming down his face. "It's not fair. None of this is fair. I finally found someone who cares about me and helps me and makes me feel safe, and now you're going away just like Daddy did." Gideon pulled the boy into his arms, holding him while he sobbed, feeling his own tears finally fall after weeks of holding them back. "You're right," he said. "It's not fair. It's cruel and wrong, and I hate that this is happening. But Micah, listen to me. I'm not gone yet. I'm still here. And I will be here, really here, for as long as my body lets me. Not in a hospital bed too sick to talk. Not passed out from medication. Here, in the library, reading with you, helping with homework, being your it." He paused, then said the word neither of them had quite dared to use before. "Being your grandfather. For as long as I can." Micah pulled back, wiping his eyes. "Promise?" "I promise. And I promise something else too. I've made arrangements, legal arrangements. The library, all those books, they're yours. Vale Manor is yours. After I'm gone, when you turn 25, it all becomes yours to do with as you choose. Keep it, sell it, turn it into something new. But it's yours because that library brought me back to life, and I want you to have it." "I don't want the library," Micah said, his voice small. "I want you." "I know, buddy, I know, but you can't have me forever. None of us get forever, so we make the most of now." They stayed there in Micah's doorway for a long time, holding each other, crying together, beginning the painful work of accepting what couldn't be changed. Eventually, Maria brought them both tissues and gentle suggestions that maybe they could talk more in the library, where it felt more comfortable, more like home. The next afternoon, Micah returned to Vale Manor. He was quieter than before, more subdued, but he came. He sat at his table with his homework, and Gideon sat beside him, and they worked through math problems and vocabulary words with an intensity that came from knowing each session was precious. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm established itself. Gideon spent mornings with his biological family, having breakfast with Richard and discussing business succession plans, having lunch with Patricia and recording more stories for Hannah, having dinner with James, and simply being present in his son's life. Afternoons belonged to Micah, the library, their quiet conversations and shared reading. Evenings were often spent with both families together, the boundaries between biological and chosen family becoming increasingly blurred as everyone adjusted to the reality of limited time. Gideon's health remained relatively stable through July and into August, the cancer progressing but not yet debilitating. He tired more easily than before, sometimes needing afternoon naps that cut into his time with Micah. His appetite decreased, his clothes hanging looser on his frame. But he was still present, still engaged, still living rather than merely dying. It was mid-September, nearly 10 months after that rainy November day that had changed everything, when Gideon woke up one morning and knew his time was getting shorter. Not from any specific symptom, just a deep internal knowing, the kind of certainty Helen had described in her final weeks. His body was beginning its final decline. He called Dr. Morrison, who confirmed what he already knew. The cancer had progressed significantly. Weeks now, possibly days. Time to consider hospice care, to make final arrangements, to say whatever goodbyes still needed saying. Gideon refused hospitalization, choosing instead to stay at Vale Manor with round-the-clock nursing care that Edmund coordinated with his usual efficiency. A hospital bed was set up in the library, at Gideon's insistence, because if he was going to die, he wanted to die surrounded by books and memories and the space where he'd learned to live again. His children visited daily, sometimes multiple times a day, bringing the grandchildren, sharing meals, telling stories, doing the hard work of letting go while still holding on. Micah came every afternoon after school, sitting beside Gideon's bed and reading aloud from Treasure Island, continuing the adventure they'd started months ago, determined to finish the story before the ending they both knew was coming. On a Thursday evening in late September, with autumn's first real chill settling over Massachusetts, Gideon gathered both families around his bed, Richard and Patricia and James with their spouses and children, Maria and Micah, Edmund hovering nearby, professional as always, but with tears visible in his eyes. "I want to thank you all," Gideon began, his voice weaker than it had been, but still clear, "for giving me these months, for forgiving my failures, for showing up even when it was hard, for letting me be part of your lives in a real way instead of just going through the motions." He looked at Richard. "You taught me that it's never too late to be honest, even when honesty is painful. Thank you for being willing to have hard conversations." To Patricia, "You taught me that documentation matters, that preserving memories is a gift to future generations. Hannah, your recordings will mean more to me than any monument." To James, "You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you're not strong enough and asking for help anyway. Thank you for your vulnerability." Then he turned to Micah, this child who'd catalyzed everything, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You taught me the most important lesson of all," he said. "You taught me that kindness costs something, and the cost is what makes it valuable. You gave me your jacket when you were cold. You protected money you desperately needed. You offered me your father's car rather than let your mother suffer. And in doing all that, you gave me back my life. Whatever time I've had since that November day, however many months or weeks or days, all of it has been a gift from you." Micah was crying silently, holding Maria's hand, and Gideon reached out to take his other hand. "The library is yours," Gideon continued. "Vale Manor is yours, not because you earned it or deserve it more than anyone else, but because you showed me what this place could be when it's filled with life instead of loneliness. Use it well. Fill it with laughter. Let other kids who need a safe place find one here. Make it what I couldn't, a home instead of a fortress." He looked at Richard then, seeing the tension in his oldest son's face. They discussed the will, the estate distribution, and while Richard had accepted the provisions for Micah and Maria, acceptance didn't mean happiness. "Richard, you'll receive the companies, the investments, the bulk of the liquid assets, everything needed to continue the Vale legacy and business. Patricia, James, your trusts are substantial and will provide security for your children and grandchildren. But the manor itself, the physical place where I learned to be human again, that goes to Micah. Not because I love you less, but because this place needs someone who'll love it for what it is rather than what it's worth." Richard was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand, and for what it's worth, I think Mom would approve. She always said this house needed children running through it." The gathering continued for another hour, stories being shared, tears being shed, goodbyes being said in the oblique way people use when they can't quite bear to acknowledge finality. Eventually, the families began to drift away, promising to return the next day, carrying with them the weight of approaching loss. Only Micah remained, refusing to leave despite Maria's gentle suggestions that Mr. Vale needed to rest. "I want to finish the book," Micah insisted. "We're almost at the end. Jim Hawkins is about to escape from the pirates. I want to know how it ends." "Then finish it," Gideon said, settling back against his pillows. "I'd like to know how it ends too." So Micah read, his young voice steady despite the tears that occasionally interrupted the narrative. And Gideon listened to the story of treasure and adventure and finding your way home despite impossible odds. When the final page was turned and Jim Hawkins had returned safely with his share of the treasure, Micah closed the book and looked at Gideon with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "Did you find your treasure?" the boy asked. "Before you got sick?" Gideon smiled, reaching out to ruffle Micah's hair in the gesture that had become their ritual. "I found something better than treasure. I found out that I was wrong about almost everything that mattered. I found out that people can be kind even when it costs them everything. I found out that broken things can be made whole if you're willing to do the work. And I found out that 8 months of really living is worth more than 3 years of existing. So yes, Micah, I found my treasure. You gave it to me that first day when you covered a cold old man with your jacket." Micah climbed carefully onto the bed, curling up beside Gideon the way a grandchild might, and Gideon wrapped his arm around the boy's small shoulders. "I'm going to miss you so much," Micah whispered. "I know. I'm going to miss you too. But Micah, listen. The library will be here. The books will be here. And every time you sit at your table and do homework or read a story, I'll be here too. Maybe not physically, but in every lesson we shared, every conversation we had, every moment you showed me what kindness looks like when it's real. You carry me with you now, just like you carry your father. We don't really leave the people we love. We become part of who they are." They stayed like that as the autumn evening darkened into night, the boy and the old man holding on to each other and to whatever time remained. Gideon died 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when the October light was streaming through the library windows and painting everything in shades of gold. Edmund was with him, and Maria, and all 3 of his children who'd rushed over when the nurse called to say the end was near. Micah was at church with Maria's sister, spared the actual moment of death, but not its impact. He went peacefully, his final words a whispered "thank you" that might have been meant for his family or for Helen or for a 7-year-old boy who taught him how to live again. The funeral was held at the church Helen had attended, a small Episcopal parish that still used traditional liturgy. Hundreds of people came. Business associates, former employees, family members both close and distant. But the eulogy that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Micah, dressed in his best clothes with his hair carefully combed, stood at the pulpit with a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "Mr. Vale taught me a lot of things," the boy began, his voice small but steady in the cavernous church. "He taught me about multiplication and spelling and how to find books in the library. But the most important thing he taught me was about fixing broken things." He pulled something from his pocket, the toy car, its gold wheel gleaming even in the church's subdued lighting. "This was my daddy's car. It was broken, missing a wheel, and I thought it would always be broken. But Mr. Vale showed me that broken things can be made whole again if someone cares enough to do the work. He fixed my car, but more important, he fixed himself. He was broken too, after his wife died. Broken and sad and mean to people because he thought everyone was bad. But I showed him that some people are good even when being good is hard. And he believed me. He let himself be fixed." Micah's voice wavered, but he pressed on. "He gave me a library and a home and helped my mama and made me feel safe. But the best thing he gave me was showing me that it's never too late to choose to be better. That even when you've been wrong for a long time, you can still choose to be right. That broken things can roll smooth again if you replace the missing pieces with something precious." He held up the car so everyone could see it. "I'm going to keep this forever. And every time I look at the gold wheel, I'm going to remember that Mr. Vale used to be broken and lonely, but he let love fix him. and I'm going to try to be the kind of person who fixes broken things instead of walking past them, because that's what he taught me. That's what he would want. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when Micah finished and returned to his seat beside Maria. Even Richard, stoic and controlled, was openly crying. The will reading happened a week later, conducted in the library that would soon belong to Micah. The specifics of the estate distribution were complicated. Companies divided among the children, trusts established for grandchildren, charitable foundations created in Helen's name. But the bombshell came at the end when the lawyer read the final provisions. To Micah Chen, I leave Vale Manor and all its contents to be held in trust until his 25th birthday. Should he choose not to keep the property, the proceeds from its sale shall fund a foundation dedicated to providing housing and educational support for families experiencing homelessness and poverty, families like his own who need a safe harbor and second chances. Richard's face was unreadable, but he didn't object. None of the children did. They'd had months to accept this decision, to understand that Vale Manor wasn't just a valuable property, but a symbol of their father's transformation. Additionally, the lawyer continued, I leave Micah one final gift. He produced a velvet box, small and formal, and handed it to Maria, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was the toy car, but transformed once more. The entire body had been plated in gold, every surface gleaming, every detail preserved but elevated, and attached to it was a small plaque that read, For Micah, the first payment for my redemption, the most valuable thing I ever received. Keep it safe, and remember that broken things can become precious when they're repaired with love. Gideon Vale. Micah took the car from the box, holding it carefully, and for the first time since Gideon's death, he smiled. A small, sad smile, but genuine. He really did fix it, the boy whispered. He fixed everything. 10 years passed. Micah grew from a 7-year-old who needed a safe place into a 17-year-old preparing for college. The library at Vale Manor remained his sanctuary, the space where he studied and dreamed and slowly processed the grief of losing 2 fathers before he'd turned 8. Maria had remarried, a kind man who understood that Micah came with complications and loved them both anyway. She'd completed her accounting degree and now managed the charitable foundation that Gideon's children had established in their father's name. Richard visited occasionally, bringing his own grandchildren to play in the gardens Helen had planted. Patricia had written a book about her father's transformation, dedicating it to the boy with the jacket who taught my father how to love again. James had taken over day-to-day management of the Vale companies, running them with an unexpected blend of his father's business acumen and his mother's compassion. But it was Micah who truly carried on Gideon's legacy. He'd decided that when he turned 25, he wouldn't sell Vale Manor. Instead, he'd transform it into something new, a residential program for children aging out of foster care, giving them the same safe harbor Gideon had given him. A place where broken things could be made whole, where kindness was taught by example, where libraries full of books offered adventures to kids who needed escape and hope in equal measure. On the 10-year anniversary of Gideon's death, Micah stood in the library holding the gold-plated car and thinking about redemption and transformation and the strange alchemy that turns broken toys into precious relics. Edmund, now retired but still a frequent visitor, stood beside him. He'd be proud of you, the old butler said quietly, of who you've become, of what you're planning to do with this place. I hope so, Micah replied. I'm just trying to pay forward what he gave me, a second chance, a safe place, someone who believed I was worth investing in. You gave him something equally valuable, Edmund pointed out. You gave him a reason to live again, a reason to choose quality over quantity, presence over isolation. In many ways, you saved each other. Micah nodded, turning the car over in his hands, watching the gold catch the afternoon light. The toy that had started as a broken relic of a dead father had become something else entirely, a symbol of transformation, of the power of kindness to catalyze change, of the possibility that broken things could be made not just whole, but precious. He thought about that November day 10 years ago when he'd given a cold stranger his jacket, not because he expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. How that simple act of kindness had cascaded into a transformation that touched dozens of lives, and would continue touching lives long after both he and Gideon were gone. The library door opened and Maria appeared with her husband and their two young children, Micah's half-siblings, who'd never met Gideon but who played in the library he'd loved, who benefited from the stability his generosity had provided. "Ready to go?" Maria asked. "We're meeting Richard and Patricia for dinner. They want to discuss the Foundation's expansion plans." "Ready," Micah confirmed, carefully placing the gold car back on the shelf beside his spelling bee ribbon and a framed photo of a smiling old man with his arm around a 7-year-old boy. As they left the library, Micah paused at the threshold and looked back at the space that had shaped him, at the shelves full of books and memories and proof that choosing kindness over cynicism could change the world in ways both large and small. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to Gideon or his father or the universe that had brought them all together. "Thank you for teaching me that broken things can become precious, that missing pieces can be replaced with gold, that it's never too late to choose love over fear." The library didn't answer, but in the quality of the silence, warm and welcoming, full of potential and promise, Micah felt the response anyway. Outside, autumn was settling over Massachusetts with the same crisp beauty it had brought 10 years ago. Leaves were turning gold and red. The air carried the scent of approaching winter. And somewhere in the gardens Helen Vale had planted decades ago, roses bloomed that she would never see, but that continued growing anyway, persistent in their beauty, refusing to let death have the final word. And in a library in a Gothic mansion on a Massachusetts cliff, a gold-plated toy car sat on a shelf beside other precious relics, gleaming proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't money or property, but the lessons taught by a 7-year-old to a 75-year-old about what it means to be human. Broken things could be made whole. Missing pieces could be replaced with something precious. And sometimes, just sometimes, a wet jacket offered to a sleeping stranger could catalyze transformations that echoed across generations, turning cynicism into trust, isolation into connection, and a dying man's final months into a legacy of love that would outlive them all. The car's gold wheel caught the last rays of afternoon sun, gleaming like a promise kept, like redemption earned, like proof that mercy, given freely when it cost everything, was the only currency that truly mattered in the end.